What if China had discovered America first? The moon rises over the harbor at Nanjing, casting silver light across hundreds of ships. The year is 1421, and the greatest fleet the world has ever seen prepares for yet another voyage into the unknown. Treasure ships tower above the water, their 9 masts reaching toward the heavens like fingers grasping at destiny. Admiral Zheng He stands on the deck of his flagship, a vessel so massive that Christopher Columbus's entire fleet, 70 years in the future, could fit on its deck with room to spare. Tonight, we ask a question that echoes across the centuries. What if those ships had not turned back? What if, instead of returning to the familiar waters of the Indian Ocean, Zheng He's fleet had pushed eastward, riding the Pacific currents to shores no Chinese eye had ever seen? What if the dragon banner of Ming China had been the first Old World flag to fly over the Americas? This is not fantasy, but the examination of a moment balanced on the edge of possibility. History is filled with such moments, decisions made or unmade that change everything that follows. The Chinese treasure fleets were real. Their technology was superior. Their resources were vast beyond imagination. Only political will and imperial decree prevented them from reaching across the Pacific. And if those decrees had been different, if the bureaucrats in Beijing had made other choices, the world you inhabit today would be utterly unrecognizable. Tonight, we stand at that crossroads. We watch as the greatest maritime power on Earth considers its options. We see the Americas waiting, unsuspecting, on the far side of the world's largest ocean, and we follow the thread of what might have been, seeing where it leads, what world it creates. The night is long, the story is vast, and the implications stretch across 6 centuries to touch every aspect of the world we know. The South China Sea is calm tonight, and somewhere across the Pacific, the Aztecs are building their empire. The Inca are carving terraces into mountain slopes, and history waits to be written differently. The dragon's naval supremacy. To understand how China might have discovered America, we must first comprehend the sheer magnitude of Chinese maritime capability in the early 15th century. This is not merely a matter of having ships, though China certainly had those in abundance. It is about possessing an entire civilization organized around maritime excellence, backed by the resources of the world's largest and most sophisticated economy. The Ming Dynasty, established in 1368 after overthrowing the Mongol Yuan dynasty, inherited a rich tradition of shipbuilding and naval expertise. By the time the Yongle Emperor ascended to the throne in 1402, China possessed shipyards capable of constructing vessels on a scale that would not be matched in the West for 400 years. The Longjiang shipyard near Nanjing alone employed thousands of workers and could build dozens of ships simultaneously. These were not crude vessels, but sophisticated machines representing the pinnacle of pre-industrial maritime technology. Chinese shipbuilding had evolved over millennia of river and coastal navigation. The distinctive features of Chinese junks, developed through centuries of refinement, made them remarkably seaworthy. The flat-bottomed hull design, while seeming counterintuitive to Western eyes, actually provided excellent stability in both shallow and deep water. The absence of a keel was compensated for by the hull's breadth and the sophisticated use of multiple masts. Most revolutionary was the division of the hull into watertight compartments, a technology Europe would not adopt until the 18th century. If one section flooded, the others remained intact, preventing the ship from sinking. The rudder technology alone was centuries ahead of European ships. Chinese vessels employed a central sternpost rudder, mounted on the ship's centerline, allowing for precise control even in heavy seas. This rudder could be raised or lowered depending on water depth, a flexibility European ships lacked. Western vessels still relied on side-mounted steering oars or primitive rudders, making them far less maneuverable. A Chinese captain could navigate channels and coastlines that would be deadly to European vessels. Navigation technology was equally advanced. The Chinese had invented the magnetic compass during the Song Dynasty, using it for maritime navigation by 1100 CE. While Europeans would eventually acquire compass technology, they did so through trade with the Islamic world, which had learned it from China. Chinese navigators also employed sophisticated astronomical observations, using the positions of stars to determine latitude. Detailed sailing directions, known as rutters, recorded currents, winds, landmarks, and hazards for known routes. These documents represented accumulated knowledge from generations of sailors. But it was in ship size that Chinese maritime achievement becomes most debated. Historical records from the Ming Dynasty describe treasure ships of extraordinary dimensions. According to some later Chinese sources, these vessels measured approximately 400 feet in length and 160 feet in width. However, modern historians vigorously debate these figures. Conservative scholars, examining the engineering limitations of wooden ship construction, argue that the largest ships were likely between 200 and 300 feet long. The debate continues because contemporary sources from Zheng He's era don't actually specify ship dimensions in the oldest surviving texts. What we can say with confidence is that even at the most conservative estimates, Chinese treasure ships were substantially larger than any European vessels of the time, which typically measured under 100 feet in length. The discovery of a massive rudder over 30 feet long suggests ships of at least 300 feet, though questions remain about whether this represents the absolute largest vessels or more typical examples. These weren't theoretical vessels, but actual ships that made multiple voyages across the Indian Ocean. Based on what contemporary accounts do tell us, the ships likely had multiple masts, possibly 5 or 6 carrying large sails. The hull was constructed from tropical hardwood, strong and resistant to rot. The ships were painted and treated with tung oil for waterproofing. Iron nails and clamps held the planking together, technology that was advanced for the era. The largest treasure ships, whatever their exact dimensions, required crews of several hundred men and could carry substantial cargo. The interior layout of these vessels resembled floating palaces more than mere ships. Multiple decks housed not just cargo and crew, but also officials, diplomats, and the treasures that gave the ships their name. Private cabins for officers featured real furniture, windows, and even small gardens in pots. The ships carried fresh water in large ceramic containers, allowing for extended voyages. Livestock was kept on board, providing fresh meat. The ships were armed with dozens of small bronze cannons for defense, though they rarely needed them. The sheer size and obvious power of the fleet usually convinced potential adversaries to negotiate rather than fight. The treasure ships formed the centerpiece of much larger fleets. A typical expedition included not just the massive treasure ships, but hundreds of support vessels. There were warships for protection, equipped with trebuchets and flaming arrows in addition to cannons. Supply ships carried extra food, water, and materials. Water tankers ensured the fleet never ran dry. Horse ships transported cavalry and their mounts. There were ships specially designed to carry tribute goods and ships built for speed to carry messages. The logistics of coordinating such a fleet was staggering, yet the Chinese managed it repeatedly. The first of Zheng He's voyages departed in 1405 with 317 ships and nearly 28,000 men. To put this in perspective, this single Chinese fleet carried more people than lived in most European cities of the time. The Spanish Armada of 1588, considered a vast force that threatened all of Europe, comprised only 130 ships with 30,000 men. Zheng He's first voyage alone nearly matched that, and it was merely an exploration and trade mission, not a military invasion. The crew composition revealed the expedition's complexity. There were sailors, of course, thousands of them recruited from Fujian province where the best seafarers lived. There were soldiers, elite troops drawn from the Ming military. There were translators who spoke Arabic, Persian, Indian languages, and the various tongues of Southeast Asia. There were astronomers to navigate by the stars, scribes to record observations, Accountants to track trade goods, cooks to feed thousands, and doctors to treat illness and injury. There were artisans to make repairs, merchants to conduct trade, and diplomats to negotiate with foreign rulers. There were Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, and Taoist priests to serve the spiritual needs of the diverse crew. Zheng He himself embodied this diversity. Born Ma He in Yunnan province to a Muslim family, he was captured during Ming military campaigns and made a eunuch, entering imperial service. He distinguished himself in the civil war that brought the Yongle emperor to power and was rewarded with promotion and the honorific name Zheng He. His religious eclecticism, honoring both the Muslim faith of his birth and the Tianfei goddess venerated by Chinese sailors, made him an ideal commander for expeditions that would encounter many faiths and peoples. His physical presence was reportedly imposing, described as tall and strong, with a powerful voice that could be heard across a ship's deck in a storm. The voyages themselves ranged across the known world. The first expedition, departing in 1405, reached Champa, modern Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Sri Lanka, and India. The second voyage, from 1407 to 1409, followed similar routes but pushed further, reaching Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The third voyage expanded Chinese diplomatic contacts across Southeast Asia and India. It was the fourth voyage, from 1413 to 1415, that reached Arabia and East Africa, bringing Chinese ships to Aden, the Red Sea, and down the East African coast to Mogadishu and Malindi in modern Kenya. The impact of these voyages on the places visited was profound. Chinese sources record that envoys from over 30 kingdoms traveled back to China with the fleet, bringing tribute and establishing diplomatic relations. The Chinese ships brought porcelain, silk, and manufactured goods that were highly valued. They took back exotic animals, including giraffes that caused wonder in the imperial court, precious stones, medicines, and woods. But more than trade goods, they exchanged ideas, technologies, and knowledge. Chinese cartographers updated their maps with new information. Foreign rulers learned of Chinese technology and culture. A network of relationships spread across the Indian Ocean, centered on China. Then, inexplicably from a modern perspective, it stopped. After the seventh voyage returned in 1433, the treasure fleets were abandoned. The Yongle Emperor had died in 1424, and his successors had different priorities. The Confucian bureaucrats who advised the emperor argued that the voyages were wasteful, draining resources needed for defending the northern frontier against resurgent Mongol tribes. They contended that China needed nothing from abroad, and that foreign trade was corrupting to proper Confucian values. Private maritime trade was restricted, then banned. The great ships were left to rot at their moorings. Records of the voyages were destroyed, deliberately burned to prevent future emperors from being tempted to resume them. This decision, made in the imperial capital thousands of miles from the sea, changed world history. Had it been made differently, had the voyages continued, the trajectory of human civilization would have diverged fundamentally from the path we know. The technology existed. The resources were available. The knowledge of navigation and shipbuilding was unmatched. Only will was lacking. But for our alternative history, we need not imagine merely continuing the existing voyages. We must imagine something more. A decision to push beyond the known world, to explore not just westward across the Indian Ocean, but eastward across the Pacific. This was not impossible. The ocean currents and winds that eventually allowed Europeans to cross the Pacific would have been equally available to Chinese navigators. The ships were certainly capable of the journey. All that was required was imperial decree and the vision to imagine what might lie beyond the horizon. The plausible path. Across the Pacific Ocean is vast beyond easy comprehension, covering more than 60 million square miles, nearly a third of Earth's surface. To cross it intentionally requires not just courage, but knowledge of wind patterns, ocean currents, and navigation techniques. Yet it is crossable, as Magellan would prove in 1521, and as Spanish galleons would demonstrate repeatedly for 2.5 centuries. The question is not whether Chinese ships could have crossed the Pacific, but whether they would have had reason to try and how they might have succeeded. Understanding the oceanic conditions is essential. The Pacific is dominated by two great circular current systems. In the northern Pacific, the North Pacific Gyre flows clockwise, driven by the trade winds near the equator and the westerlies in the northern latitudes. The southern Pacific has a counterclockwise gyre. These currents create natural maritime highways for those who know how to use them. A ship leaving the coast of China and heading east would encounter the Kuroshio Current, a powerful warm current flowing northeastward along Japan. This would naturally carry ships toward the Aleutian Islands and the coast of Alaska. But reaching America via the northern route would deposit travelers in a cold, forbidding region, far from the rich civilizations we know existed further south. A more promising route would involve first heading south along the Chinese coast, then catching the North Equatorial Current, which flows westward across the Pacific. This seems counterintuitive for reaching America, but it's actually the key. By following this current to the Philippines and beyond, ships would eventually reach the point where the current begins to curve north, becoming the Kuroshio Current heading back east. The alternative, and perhaps more likely, route would be to sail south to Southeast Asia, then catch the southeast trade winds that blow toward the northeast, carrying ships across the Pacific towards Central America. This is essentially the route later used by Spanish galleons sailing from the Philippines to Mexico. The winds are reliable, the weather generally favorable, and the destination would place Chinese ships on the coast of what is now Mexico or Central America, precisely where the most advanced indigenous civilizations could be found. Gavin Menzies, in his controversial book, 1421, The Year China Discovered America, argued that Chinese fleets did reach the Americas, basing his claims on his interpretation of maps, alleged artifacts, and circumstantial evidence. Professional historians have overwhelmingly and emphatically rejected Menzies' claims. Robert Finlay, writing in the Journal of World History, characterized Menzies' work as dealing with evidence in a reckless manner and concluded that his hypotheses were advanced without a shred of proof. The consensus among mainstream historians and sinologists is unambiguous. There is no credible evidence that Chinese ships reached the Americas in the 15th century. Menzies' work has been categorized as pseudo-history rather than legitimate historical scholarship. Yet the fact that it didn't happen doesn't mean it couldn't have happened, at least in theory. The technology existed. Chinese ships had successfully sailed to East Africa, a distance comparable to a Pacific crossing. The navigational knowledge was present. What was lacking was motivation and, crucially, imperial political will. The Chinese expeditions had specific goals centered on the tributary system and trade within the known world of the Indian Ocean. Heading into the unknown Pacific offered no obvious benefits to justify the substantial risk and expense to the Ming court, but let us imagine a different set of circumstances, a divergence in the historical path. Suppose the political situation in China had been different. Perhaps the Yongle Emperor lived longer, maintaining his support for maritime exploration. Perhaps reports reached the Court of Lands to the east, though we should note there's no historical evidence of such reports. Perhaps a storm blew ships off course, as happened regularly in the Age of Sail, and they stumbled upon islands that proved to be stepping stones across the Pacific. Or perhaps simple curiosity and ambition, the same forces that drove European exploration in our timeline, might have motivated a Chinese admiral to wonder what lay beyond the eastern horizon. These are speculations, but they're speculations grounded in what was technically possible rather than fantasies divorced from reality. The journey would have been long, but not impossible. A voyage from the coast of China to Central America, following the trade winds and currents, would cover approximately 7,000 to 8,000 nautical miles. Chinese treasure ships could carry supplies for months at sea. Fresh water was stored in large ceramic containers. Rice, dried fish, and preserved vegetables formed the basis of the shipboard diet. Live animals provided fresh meat. The ships were large enough that part of the deck could be devoted to growing vegetables in containers, providing some fresh food. This was not a pleasant journey, but it was survivable with the resources Chinese ships carried. Navigation would rely on a combination of techniques. The compass would give direction. Observations of the sun and stars would provide latitude. Sailing directions would note the prevailing winds and currents. Perhaps most importantly, the vast extent of the Pacific would actually help rather than hinder discovery. The Pacific is not empty but dotted with islands. Hawaii, though far north of the most direct route, would be hard to miss for ships traveling in that direction. The Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and other archipelagos scattered across the ocean would provide stopping points. Polynesians had been navigating these waters for centuries, island hopping across vast distances. Chinese ships, larger and more heavily provisioned, could have done the same. The crucial moment would come when the American coast appeared on the horizon. Depending on the route taken, this might be the western coast of Mexico, the coasts of Central America, or possibly even South America. The sight would have been astonishing to the... For our alternative history, let us place the first Chinese landing on the Pacific coast of Mexico, perhaps near the site of what would become Acapulco. The year is 1421, the same year as Zheng He's sixth voyage in our timeline. The fleet that arrives is not the full treasure fleet, but a smaller expedition, perhaps 5 treasure ships and 20 support vessels, carrying 5,000 men. It is still vastly larger than anything that will be seen in these waters for another century. The ships anchor in a natural harbour, and scouts go ashore. They find a land of incredible richness. The forests are thick with timber, streams flow with clean water, the soil is fertile, and most importantly, there are people, settled people, living in organized communities, people who farm and build and trade. The initial encounters are cautious on both sides. The Chinese, experienced in diplomacy from decades of trading across the Indian Ocean, approach with gifts and gestures of peace. The local inhabitants, perhaps Purepecha or other peoples of the Pacific coast of Mexico, are astounded by these visitors from an unknown land who arrive in ships larger than anything they have ever imagined. Communication begins through gestures, then through the patient work of establishing a common vocabulary. The Chinese have brought translators fluent in many languages, though none that help here. But language is learned quickly when both sides desire communication. Within weeks, basic concepts can be exchanged. The Chinese want to know what lies in land, what peoples live here, what resources are available. The locals want to know where these strange visitors come from, what they want, whether they are gods or demons or simply men from a far land. And thus, contact is established. The first meeting between Old World and New World civilizations, but under Chinese auspices rather than European. The implications of this moment will echo across centuries, reshaping both Americas and Asia in ways we must now explore. First contact, a Confucian encounter. The moment when the first Chinese ships appeared on the coast of the Americas would have been, for the indigenous peoples who witnessed it, an event beyond their experience or imagination. The treasure ships alone would have seemed like floating mountains, their sails visible for miles, their hulls painted with bright colors and decorated with dragons and clouds. The sheer size would have been incomprehensible to peoples whose largest watercraft were dugout canoes or reed rafts. When these vessels anchored and smaller boats began ferrying men and materials to shore, the observers would have struggled to understand what they were seeing. For the Chinese, the encounter would have been less shocking, but no less significant. They had visited many foreign lands, encountered diverse peoples, and learned to navigate the complexities of cross-cultural communication. But the Americas represented something unprecedented. a populated continent unknown to Chinese geography. Peoples with no place in the Chinese understanding of the world, civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from the old world. The bureaucrats and scholars traveling with the fleet would have rushed to record everything, seeking to understand how these peoples fit into the Tianxia, the all-under-heaven concept that structured Chinese thinking about the world. The specific location of first contact matters enormously for how the encounter would unfold. If Chinese ships reached the coast of Mexico, as we have imagined, they would quickly learn of the existence of the Aztec Empire to the east and south. The Aztec, or more properly the Mexica, were at the height of their power in 1421. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, housed perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world, comparable to major Chinese cities. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways, supplied by Chinampa's floating gardens, it was a marvel of urban planning and engineering. The Aztec Empire dominated central Mexico through a combination of military power, tribute extraction, and carefully cultivated terror, particularly through their practice of large-scale human sacrifice. The initial contact would likely not be with the Aztec themselves, but with coastal peoples who were either allied with or subject to Aztec power. These intermediaries would carry news of the foreign visitors to the capital. We can imagine the message arriving at the imperial court. Strange men from across the eastern sea, arriving in impossible ships, claiming to represent a distant emperor. The Aztec response would depend on how they interpreted these visitors. Were they gods, as some would later interpret Cortes? Merely powerful foreigners? Potential allies or threats? The Chinese approach to diplomacy, developed over centuries of dealing with foreign peoples, would follow predictable patterns. They would seek to identify the local power structure, establish communication with rulers, offer gifts as tokens of goodwill, and attempt to incorporate the newly discovered peoples into the tributary system. This system, which had governed Chinese foreign relations for centuries, was based on a hierarchical worldview in which China was the central kingdom, the source of civilization, and all other states were peripheral and subordinate. Foreign rulers, who acknowledged Chinese superiority through tribute missions, received recognition, trade privileges, and protection in return. Applying this framework to the Americas would require some adaptation. The tributary system assumed a world where Chinese civilization was known and respected, where the benefits of association with China were obvious. In the Americas, none of this would be true. The indigenous peoples had never heard of China, had no reason to consider it superior, and would see no immediate benefit in sending tribute missions across an ocean they didn't know existed. The Chinese would need to demonstrate their superiority through more direct means. This is where the nature of Chinese power projection becomes important. Unlike later European colonizers, who would arrive in small numbers and rely heavily on indigenous allies and internal divisions to conquer, the Chinese would come with overwhelming force. 5,000 men, well-armed and disciplined, supported by the advanced technology of Chinese civilization, would represent a military force unmatched in the Americas. But Chinese imperial ideology emphasized virtue and civilization over mere force. The ideal was to win submission through the manifest superiority of Chinese culture, not through conquest. Consider how this might play out with the Aztec. Chinese envoys, after establishing communication, would travel to Tenochtitlan, bearing gifts of silk, porcelain, and other Chinese manufactures. The urban sophistication of the Aztec capital would impress the Chinese visitors, who were accustomed to judging civilizations by their cities. They would find much to admire: the scale of the city, the organized markets, the complex social hierarchy, the evidence of central planning and state power. But they would also be horrified by the human sacrifices, the skull racks displaying thousands of victims, the casual brutality of Aztec religious practices. The Aztec, for their part, would be equally impressed and disturbed by what they learned of China. The description of an empire spanning thousands of miles, encompassing countless peoples, ruled by a single emperor from a forbidden city, would challenge their understanding of political possibility. The Chinese goods, particularly porcelain and silk, would be unlike anything they had seen. But the Chinese rejection of human sacrifice, their different religious practices, their strange writing system, all of this would mark them as fundamentally alien. The negotiation would be complex. The Chinese would propose a tributary relationship. The Aztec emperor would acknowledge the Ming emperor as the supreme ruler, send occasional tribute missions to China, adopt the Chinese calendar, and receive in return Chinese recognition, trade goods, and theoretical protection. The Aztec would see this as unacceptable, demanding they subordinate themselves to a foreign power, but they would also recognize the danger of refusing these powerful strangers. The most likely outcome would be a compromise, perhaps an exchange of embassies and gifts that each side interpreted according to their own worldview. The Chinese would record the Aztec as accepting tributary status. The Aztec would view it as a trade agreement with powerful foreigners, but contact would not stop with diplomacy. Chinese sailors and soldiers would interact with local populations. Trade would begin, perhaps unofficially at first. Chinese goods would begin flowing into American markets. And most significantly, disease would begin its terrible work. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to old world diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens would have devastating effects. Chinese ships carrying crew members from across Asia and Africa would have introduced multiple diseases simultaneously. This demographic catastrophe might actually reinforce Chinese claims to superiority. As epidemics swept through indigenous populations, killing vast numbers while leaving the Chinese relatively unaffected, it would seem like divine judgment. The Chinese, interpreting this through their own cultural lens, might see it as evidence that the mandate of heaven extended to their presence in the Americas. The indigenous survivors, desperately seeking explanation for the horror, might conclude that the Chinese possessed powerful magic, for our alternative history, let us place the first Chinese landing on the Pacific coast of Mexico, perhaps near the site of what would become Acapulco. The year is 1421, the same year as Zheng He's sixth voyage in our timeline. The fleet that arrives is not the full treasure fleet, but a smaller expedition, perhaps 5 treasure ships and 20 support vessels, carrying 5,000 men. It is still vastly larger than anything that will be seen in these waters for another century. The ships anchor in a natural harbour, and scouts go ashore. They find a land of incredible richness. The forests are thick with timber, streams flow with clean water, the soil is fertile, and most importantly, there are people, settled people living in organized communities, people who farm and build and trade. The initial encounters are cautious on both sides. The Chinese, experienced in diplomacy from decades of trading across the Indian Ocean, approach with gifts and gestures of peace. The local inhabitants, perhaps Purépecha or other peoples of the Pacific coast of Mexico, are astounded by these visitors from an unknown land who arrive in ships larger than anything they have ever imagined. Communication begins through gestures, then through the patient work of establishing a common vocabulary. The Chinese have brought translators fluent in many languages, though none that help here. But language is learned quickly when both sides desire communication. Within weeks, basic concepts can be exchanged. The Chinese want to know what lies inland, what peoples live here, what resources are available. The locals want to know where these strange visitors come from, what they want, whether they are gods or demons or simply men from a far land. And thus, contact is established. The first meeting between Old World and New World civilizations, but under Chinese auspices rather than European. The implications of this moment will echo across centuries, reshaping both Americas and Asia in ways we must now explore. First contact, a Confucian encounter. The moment when the first Chinese ships appeared on the coast of the Americas would have been, for the indigenous peoples who witnessed it, an event beyond their experience or imagination. The treasure ships alone would have seemed like floating mountains, their sails visible for miles, their hulls painted with bright colors and decorated with dragons and clouds. The sheer size would have been incomprehensible to peoples whose largest watercraft were dugout canoes or reed rafts. When these vessels anchored and smaller boats began ferrying men and materials to shore, the observers would have struggled to understand what they were seeing. For the Chinese, the encounter would have been less shocking, but no less significant. They had visited many foreign lands, encountered diverse peoples, and learned to navigate the complexities of cross-cultural communication. But the Americas represented something unprecedented. A populated continent unknown to Chinese geography, peoples with no place in the Chinese understanding of the world, civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from the old world. The bureaucrats and scholars traveling with the fleet would have rushed to record everything, seeking to understand how these peoples fit into the Tianxia, the all-under-heaven concept that structured Chinese thinking about the world. The specific location of first contact matters enormously for how the encounter would unfold. If Chinese ships reached the coast of Mexico, as we have imagined, they would quickly learn of the existence of the Aztec Empire to the east and south. The Aztec, or more properly the Mexica, were at the height of their power in 1421. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, housed perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world, comparable to major Chinese cities. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways, supplied by Chinampa's floating gardens, it was a marvel of urban planning and engineering. The Aztec Empire dominated central Mexico through a combination of military power, tribute extraction, and carefully cultivated terror, particularly through their practice of large-scale human sacrifice. The initial contact would likely not be with the Aztec themselves, but with coastal peoples who were either allied with or subject to Aztec power. These intermediaries would carry news of the foreign visitors to the capital. We can imagine the message arriving at the imperial court, strange men from across the eastern sea, arriving in impossible ships, claiming to represent a distant emperor. The Aztec response would depend on how they interpreted these visitors. Were they gods, as some would later interpret Cortés? Merely powerful foreigners, potential allies or threats? The Chinese approach to diplomacy, developed over centuries of dealing with foreign peoples, would follow predictable patterns. They would seek to identify the local power structure, establish communication with rulers, offer gifts as tokens of goodwill, and attempt to incorporate the newly discovered peoples into the tributary system. This system, which had governed Chinese foreign relations for centuries, was based on a hierarchical worldview in which China was the central kingdom, the source of civilization, and all other states were peripheral and subordinate. Foreign rulers who acknowledged Chinese superiority through tribute missions received recognition, trade privileges, and protection in return. Applying this framework to the Americas would require some adaptation. The tributary system assumed a world where Chinese civilization was known and respected, where the benefits of association with China were obvious. In the Americas, none of this would be true. The indigenous peoples had never heard of China, had no reason to consider it superior, and would see no immediate benefit in sending tribute missions across an ocean they didn't know existed. The Chinese would need to demonstrate their superiority through more direct means. This is where the nature of Chinese power projection becomes important. Unlike later European colonizers, who would arrive in small numbers and rely heavily on indigenous allies and internal divisions to conquer, the Chinese would come with overwhelming force. 5,000 men, well-armed and disciplined, supported by the advanced technology of Chinese civilization, would represent a military force unmatched in the Americas. But Chinese imperial ideology emphasized virtue and civilization over mere force. The ideal was to win submission through the manifest superiority of Chinese culture, not through conquest. Consider how this might play out with the Aztec. Chinese envoys, after establishing communication, would travel to Tenochtitlan, bearing gifts of silk, porcelain, and other Chinese manufactures. The urban sophistication of the Aztec capital would impress the Chinese visitors, who were accustomed to judging civilizations by their cities. They would find much to admire: the scale of the city, the organized markets, the complex social hierarchy, the evidence of central planning and state power. But they would also be horrified by the human sacrifices, the skull racks displaying thousands of victims, the casual brutality of Aztec religious practices. The Aztec, for their part, would be equally impressed and disturbed by what they learned of China. The description of an empire spanning thousands of miles, encompassing countless peoples, ruled by a single emperor from a forbidden city, would challenge their understanding of political possibility. The Chinese goods, particularly porcelain and silk, would be unlike anything they had seen. But the Chinese rejection of human sacrifice, their different religious practices, their strange writing system, all of this would mark them as fundamentally alien. The negotiation would be complex. The Chinese would propose a tributary relationship. The Aztec emperor would acknowledge the Ming emperor as the supreme ruler, send occasional tribute missions to China, adopt the Chinese calendar, and receive in return Chinese recognition, trade goods, and theoretical protection. The Aztec would see this as unacceptable, demanding they subordinate themselves to a foreign power. But they would also recognize the danger of refusing these powerful strangers. The most likely outcome would be a compromise, perhaps an exchange of embassies and gifts that each side interpreted according to their own worldview. The Chinese would record the Aztec as accepting tributary status. The Aztec would view it as a trade agreement with powerful foreigners. But contact would not stop with diplomacy. Chinese sailors and soldiers would interact with local populations. Trade would begin, perhaps unofficially at first. Chinese goods would begin flowing into American markets. And most significantly, disease would begin its terrible work. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to old world diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens would have devastating effects. Chinese ships, carrying crew members from across Asia and Africa, would have introduced multiple diseases simultaneously. This demographic catastrophe might actually reinforce Chinese claims to superiority. As epidemics swept through indigenous populations, killing vast numbers while leaving the Chinese relatively unaffected, it would seem like divine judgment. The Chinese, interpreting this through their own cultural lens, might see it as evidence that the mandate of heaven extended to their presence in the Americas. The indigenous survivors, desperately seeking explanation for the horror, might conclude that the Chinese possessed power. If Chinese ships reached South America, perhaps landing on the coast of what is now Ecuador or Peru, they would encounter the Inca Empire, a civilization in some ways even more impressive than the Aztec. The Inca had built a vast empire stretching 2,500 miles along the Andes Mountains, linked by an incredible road system administered through a sophisticated bureaucracy, and organized around the divine kingship of the Sapa Inca. Unlike the Aztec, the Inca rarely practiced human sacrifice. They had developed a system of communal labor, the mita, and redistributive economics that would have seemed more comprehensible to Chinese bureaucrats familiar with corvée labor and state granaries. The Inca response to Chinese contact would likely be more institutionally organized than the Aztec response. The Inca state was more centralized, more bureaucratic, more capable of coordinated response. They might view the Chinese as potential allies or competitors, depending on how the initial contacts unfolded. The Inca had only recently expanded into the coastal regions. Much of their empire was highland, making them somewhat removed from initial coastal contacts. This might buy time for them to formulate a response. In North America, Chinese contact would be more diffuse. The peoples north of Mexico were not organized into large empires, but lived in smaller societies. The Mississippian culture, centered on sites like Cahokia, had already declined by 1421. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, the woodland cultures of the East, the plains hunters, All of these lived in communities of hundreds or thousands, not millions. Chinese contact in these regions would be more local, more varied, and potentially more peaceful, simply because there were no large states to clash with Chinese imperial ambitions. The cultural exchange would begin immediately. Chinese observers would note everything. The crops unknown in Asia, particularly maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao, the absence of large domesticated animals, the different architecture and city planning, the various forms of religious practice, the systems of writing and record-keeping, where they existed, the social organization and political structures. All of this would be recorded by Chinese scribes and brought back to China, expanding Chinese knowledge of the world dramatically. The indigenous peoples, meanwhile, would be learning of iron and steel technology, of gunpowder weapons, of the wheel for transportation, of different agricultural techniques, of sailing ships and navigation, of writing systems, of different political and social organizations. The temptation to acquire these technologies would be immense. Some peoples would try to trade for them. Others might try to seize them. Still others would attempt to learn and replicate them. And in both directions, ideas would flow. Chinese Buddhism, with its concepts of karma and reincarnation, might find strange echoes in indigenous beliefs. Confucian notions of social hierarchy and filial piety might resonate or conflict with indigenous social structures. The Chinese writing system, adapted to their language over millennia, would be difficult to apply to indigenous languages. But the concept of writing as permanent record might spread. Chinese art and aesthetics would begin to influence indigenous artistic traditions, even as Chinese artists encountered new forms and symbols. The stage would be set for sustained contact, for better and worse. The disease, the warfare, the cultural disruption, all of this would be as inevitable as it was tragic. But the specific forms it took, the power dynamics that evolved, the long-term relationships that developed, all of these would be fundamentally different from what occurred when Europeans arrived. We must now explore what Chinese colonization of the Americas might have looked like. The tribute system comes to the Americas. The Chinese approach to the newly discovered Americas would have been fundamentally shaped by their political philosophy and historical experience. Unlike European powers, which would develop models of direct colonial administration and settler colonialism, China's traditional approach to foreign relations was the tributary system. This system, refined over centuries, offered a template for incorporating the Americas into the Chinese world order, but adapting it to this unprecedented situation would require innovation and flexibility. At its core, the tributary system was based on several key principles. First, it acknowledged a hierarchy with China at the center, the Middle Kingdom, superior in civilization and virtue. Second, it required periodic tribute missions from vassal states to the Chinese court, where foreign rulers would perform the kowtow, prostrating themselves before the Chinese emperor. Third, in exchange for this acknowledgement of Chinese supremacy, tributary states received recognition of their rulers' legitimacy, access to Chinese trade, and theoretical protection from threats. Fourth, the system was relatively flexible in practice, tolerating considerable local autonomy as long as the forms of submission were maintained. Applying this to the Americas would present immediate challenges. The vast distance between China and the Americas would make regular tribute missions impractical. Chinese political control would need to be exercised through local representatives rather than direct administration from Beijing. The indigenous civilizations were sophisticated enough to resist crude imposition of Chinese authority, but weak enough militarily that resistance would be futile. The solution would likely be a system of indirect rule, with Chinese officials overseeing local rulers who continued to govern their own peoples. The first step would be establishing permanent Chinese settlements along the Pacific coast. These would serve multiple purposes: naval bases for the continuing voyages back to China, trading posts for exchanging goods, administrative centers from which Chinese authority could be projected, and defensive strongholds against potential resistance. The locations would be chosen carefully, prioritizing natural harbors, access to fresh water, defensible positions, and proximity to indigenous population centers. Imagine a Chinese settlement near what would become Acapulco. The site offers an excellent natural harbor, access to the interior via mountain passes, and relative proximity to both the Aztec heartland and other indigenous polities. The settlement would be built according to Chinese principles of urban planning, with a wall surrounding the main compound, a grid pattern of streets, separate quarters for officials, soldiers, merchants, and laborers, temples for various religious practices, warehouses for storing goods, and workshops for artisans. The garrison would be substantial, perhaps 1,000 soldiers initially, drawn from the troops who arrived with the fleet. They would be equipped with the best Chinese military technology: crossbows with mechanical triggers capable of rapid fire, early forms of firearms, steel armor and weapons, and explosive devices. This military force would be sufficient to dominate local conflicts, but too small to conquer vast territories. Chinese strategy would emphasize deterrence and demonstration of power rather than constant warfare. Chinese officials would begin the process of establishing relationships with indigenous leaders. This would follow patterns developed in Southeast Asia and Africa. Local rulers would be invited to the Chinese settlement, where they would be entertained lavishly, given gifts of silk and porcelain, and shown the impressive technology of Chinese civilization. The message would be clear: alliance with China brought rewards, while opposition brought overwhelming force. The economic integration would be gradual but inexorable. Chinese merchants would begin trading with indigenous populations, exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials. The Chinese wanted gold and silver, of which the Americas had tremendous quantities. They wanted exotic woods, dyes, medicinal plants, and other natural resources unknown in Asia. They would introduce new crops to the Americas, bringing rice, wheat, citrus fruits, and Asian vegetables. They would bring livestock, pigs, chickens, cattle, and water buffalo, transforming American agriculture. But the real value of the Americas to China would not be extractive in the Spanish sense. The Ming Dynasty was not desperately seeking gold to fund wars as Spain would be. China was already wealthy, its economy the largest in the world. The Americas represented something else: a vast new market for Chinese goods, a source of novel products, a demonstration of imperial reach, and a buffer against potential rivals. The tributary relationship was as much about prestige as profit. The administration of this emerging American tributary system would require innovation. The Chinese would likely establish a regional viceroyalty, perhaps calling it the Eastern Ocean Command or the New Territories Administration. The viceroy would be a high-ranking official, possibly a eunuch like Zheng He, reporting directly to the emperor. Under the viceroy would be provincial administrators responsible for different regions, mirroring the structure of domestic Chinese governance. The key to maintaining control with limited Chinese manpower would be co-opting indigenous elites. Local rulers who cooperated would be confirmed in their positions, given Chinese titles and regalia, and incorporated into the administrative structure. Their children might be brought to China for education, learning Chinese language and customs, creating a generation of indigenous elites who were culturally hybrid, loyal to both their own peoples and the Aztec Empire presents a particularly interesting case study. The Aztec themselves were relatively recent conquerors, having risen to dominance only in the previous century. Their empire was a loose confederation of tribute-paying cities held together by military power and the threat of destruction. Many subject peoples resented Aztec rule, especially the demand for sacrificial victims. The Chinese would quickly identify this internal division and exploit it. Chinese officials would meet with leaders of subject peoples, offering them an alternative to Aztec domination. Submit to Chinese authority, they would propose, and you will have protection from Aztec demands. No more tribute in the form of human victims. No more arbitrary violence. Instead, reasonable taxes in goods, recognition of your local autonomy, and access to Chinese trade. For many peoples groaning under Aztec oppression, this would seem like liberation, not conquest. The Aztec leadership would face a terrible dilemma. They could resist Chinese expansion and risk war with a technologically superior force while their own subjects defected, or they could accommodate Chinese power, accepting a tributary relationship that left them as regional administrators under Chinese oversight. Pride might demand resistance, but pragmatism would suggest accommodation. The most likely outcome would be a negotiated settlement in which the Aztec emperor acknowledged Chinese supremacy, reduced or eliminated human sacrifice under Chinese pressure, and continued to rule the Valley of Mexico as a Chinese tributary. This transformation would be profound. The end of mass human sacrifice would fundamentally alter Aztec religion and society. The practice was not incidental, but central to Aztec cosmology, which held that the sun required human blood to continue its journey across the sky. Without this religious justification, much of Aztec political structure would need to be rethought. Chinese influence might push Aztec religion toward more abstract concepts, perhaps finding points of compatibility between Aztec gods and Chinese Buddhist or Taoist deities. The Inca Empire, if contacted by Chinese ships along the South American coast, would present a different scenario. The Inca were more unified than the Aztec, with a more developed bureaucracy and better infrastructure. Their road system, spanning thousands of miles through some of the world's most difficult terrain, would impress Chinese observers who knew the value of good roads. The Inca system of recording information through quipu, knotted strings that encoded data, would fascinate Chinese bureaucrats, though they would likely push for adoption of Chinese writing. The Inca might actually find the tributary system more comprehensible than the Aztec did. Their own system was based on hierarchical relationships, with the Sapa Inca at the apex receiving labor and goods from subject peoples in exchange for redistribution and protection. The Chinese model was not entirely dissimilar. An accommodation might be reached more smoothly, with the Sapa Inca accepting a position as a great tributary king, perhaps the highest-ranking foreign ruler in the Chinese system, governing his vast empire as a Chinese vassal. The Chinese would establish their main South American base on the coast, possibly near what is now Lima. From there, trade routes would be established into the Andes, connecting to the Inca road system. Chinese goods would flow into the highland empire, while Andean gold, silver, textiles, and agricultural products would flow to the coast and from there to China. The exchange would be transformative for both civilizations. In both cases, the Chinese presence would not mean the disappearance of indigenous culture and political structures. Unlike European colonialism, which often sought to completely replace indigenous systems with European ones, Chinese colonialism was typically more conservative, preferring to work through existing structures. Local languages would continue to be spoken, though Chinese would become the language of official business and elite culture. Local religions would continue, perhaps with modifications, syncretizing with Chinese beliefs. Local rulers would remain in power, though subordinate to Chinese authority. The taxation system would be carefully calibrated to extract resources without destroying the economic base. Chinese officials had centuries of experience in balancing the need for revenue against the risk of provoking rebellion through excessive taxation. They would conduct surveys of population and resources, establish tax quotas based on local capacity to pay, and create a bureaucracy to collect and record taxes. The taxes would be paid in goods rather than money, at least initially, since the Americas lacked developed monetary systems. Chinese law would gradually be introduced, supplementing rather than replacing indigenous legal systems. Serious crimes, disputes involving Chinese subjects, and cases with implications for Chinese authority would be handled by Chinese magistrates applying Chinese law. Local disputes among indigenous peoples would continue to be handled by local systems. This legal pluralism was standard in Chinese administration of diverse populations and would work reasonably well in the Americas. The Chinese would introduce their own agricultural techniques and crops, but they would also adopt American crops. The potato, maize, and tomato would be sent back to China, where they would eventually transform Chinese agriculture and demographics, just as they did in Europe. Chinese farmers who settled in the Americas would experiment with combining Old World and New World techniques, creating hybrid agricultural systems that maximize productivity. Infrastructure development would be a priority. The Chinese would build roads connecting their coastal settlements to indigenous population centers, following Chinese engineering standards. These roads would have rest stations every 20 or 30 miles, providing accommodation for travelers and facilitating communication. Bridges would be built over rivers using Chinese techniques. The combination of Chinese coastal roads and indigenous highland roads would create a network spanning the continent. The shipbuilding industry would be established in American ports, using local timber to construct vessels for the ongoing trade with China. Chinese shipwrights would train local workers, transferring technology while maintaining control over the most sophisticated designs. The back-and-forth voyages across the Pacific would become regular, perhaps twice a year, bringing Chinese goods to America and American goods to China. This system would not be static. Over time, as Chinese settlement increased, as more indigenous peoples were incorporated into the tributary system, as hybrid Chinese-American culture developed in the coastal settlements, the relationship would evolve. Chinese officials might begin marrying into indigenous elite families, creating a mestizo class that was culturally and genetically hybrid. Chinese merchants might establish themselves in indigenous cities, creating diaspora communities analogous to Chinese communities throughout Southeast Asia. Indigenous peoples might travel to China as students, merchants, or diplomatic envoys, bringing back new ideas. The resistance to this system would be sporadic and regional rather than universal. Some peoples would see opportunity in Chinese presence and ally themselves enthusiastically. Others would resist, either openly through warfare or covertly through non-cooperation. The Chinese response would be pragmatic, combining military force where necessary with diplomatic flexibility where possible. Rebellions would be crushed, but rebels who submitted would be treated leniently, following the principle that winning hearts was more important than inflicting punishment. The disease catastrophe, meanwhile, would continue its grim work. Epidemics would sweep through indigenous populations, killing millions. The Chinese, having seen similar die-offs in Southeast Asia after contact, might implement quarantine measures. Though their understanding of disease transmission was limited, the demographic collapse would create economic problems as the labor force shrank and agricultural production declined. The Chinese would respond by importing workers from China and other parts of the empire, accelerating the demographic transformation. Within a generation, the Americas would be fundamentally changed. Chinese settlements would dot both coasts. Trade routes would connect interior civilizations to these Chinese ports. Indigenous elites would be speaking Chinese and adopting Chinese customs while maintaining elements of their traditional culture. A new hybrid society would be emerging, neither purely Chinese nor purely indigenous, but something novel. The political structure would be formally hierarchical, with China at the apex, but in practice complex and negotiated, with local autonomy within a framework of Chinese supremacy. This tributary system would not be universally beloved, any more than Spanish colonialism was. Many indigenous peoples would resent foreign domination, regardless of how it was dressed up, but it would be different from European colonization in crucial ways. The scale of genocide would be less, though disease would still kill millions. The destruction of indigenous political structures would be less complete. The preservation of indigenous culture and language, though transformed, would be greater, and the economic relationship, though exploitative, would be less purely extractive and more focused on ongoing trade and production. Whether this would be better or worse depends on one's perspective and values, but it would certainly be different, and that difference would shape the subsequent history of the Americas. The disease exchange and demographic transformation. Discussion of Chinese contact with the Americas can ignore the biological catastrophe that would inevitably follow. The Columbian Exchange, as Alfred Crosby termed the biological transfer between old and new worlds, was perhaps even more significant than the political and cultural changes that accompanied European colonization. Disease killed far more indigenous Americans than warfare, sometimes wiping out 90% or more of local populations. A Chinese discovery of America would not prevent this tragedy, though it might alter its course and consequences. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been isolated from Old World disease pools for over 12,000 years, since their ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge. In that time, they had lost or never developed immunity to diseases that plagued Old World populations. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, bubonic plague, and many others were endemic in Eurasia and Africa, creating what William McNeill called disease-experienced populations. These populations had high childhood mortality from disease, but those who survived to adulthood generally had some immunity. The cost was terrible, but the result was population stability. The Americas, by contrast, were relatively free of epidemic diseases. The limited range of domesticated animals meant fewer zoonotic diseases. The lower population density in most regions limited disease transmission. The result was a population that was actually healthier in many ways than Old World populations, with less chronic disease and disability, but also fatally vulnerable to diseases that arrived from across the ocean. When these two disease environments collided, the result was catastrophic. Chinese ships would have brought this catastrophe just as surely as Spanish ships did. The crew would have included people from across Asia and Africa, carriers of every disease common to the Old World. Some crew members would have active infections, others would be asymptomatic carriers. Still others would carry diseases in latent form, ready to flare up under stress. When these men made contact with indigenous populations who had no immunity, disease would spread like wildfire. Smallpox would be the worst killer, as it was historically. The virus is highly contagious, spreading through respiratory droplets and contact with infected materials. Its incubation period of about 12 days means infected people can travel significant distances before becoming symptomatic, spreading the disease far from its origin. The mortality rate among immunologically naive populations could reach 30% or higher. Survivors were often left blind, scarred, or otherwise disabled. The social disruption was as devastating as the death toll, as entire communities lost their elders, their leaders, their knowledge keepers all at once. Measles would follow, equally contagious but affecting primarily children. In Old World populations, measles was a childhood disease, dangerous but manageable. In the Americas, it would strike people of all ages with devastating effect. Influenza, mutating constantly, would cause repeated epidemics. Typhus, carried by lice, would spread wherever people were crowded together. Bubonic plague, if it reached the Americas, would be particularly deadly, though the absence of the right species of rats might limit its spread. The timeline of epidemics would depend on the specifics of contact. The first outbreak would occur at the initial landing site, spreading among the local population within weeks. As indigenous peoples carried goods or messages between communities, they would unknowingly carry disease. Within months, regions hundreds of miles from the initial contact point would experience outbreaks. Within a year or two, much of the continent could be affected, even areas that had no direct contact with Chinese visitors. The Chinese reaction to this die-off would be complex. They would not understand the germ theory of disease, which would not be developed until the 19th century. But they had considerable practical experience with epidemics and would recognize what was happening. Chinese medicine had developed sophisticated theories of contagion and had implemented quarantine measures during plague outbreaks. They might try to limit contact between infected and healthy populations, establishing quarantines and restricting movement. But with limited understanding of asymptomatic carriers and disease vectors, these efforts would have limited success. Some Chinese officials might interpret the epidemics as a sign of divine favor, evidence that heaven approved of Chinese expansion into the Americas. The fact that indigenous populations died in vast numbers, while Chinese remained relatively healthy, would seem to confirm Chinese superiority. This interpretation would make it easier to justify continued colonization and to dismiss indigenous suffering as inevitable or even deserved. Other Chinese observers might be more sympathetic, recognizing that disease was causing the die-off rather than any inherent weakness of indigenous peoples. Chinese medical practitioners might try to treat indigenous patients, applying Chinese medical techniques. Some treatments might help, others would be useless, but the effort would demonstrate that not all Chinese viewed indigenous peoples as expendable. Chinese doctors might document the new diseases they encountered in the Americas, just as they would document new medicinal plants and other natural phenomena. The demographic collapse would create immediate practical problems for the Chinese colonization effort. The tributary system depended on a large indigenous population to produce the goods and crops that would be sent to China as tribute. If the population shrank by 70 or 80%, as occurred in some regions after European contact, the economic base of the colonial system would collapse. The Chinese would need to adapt their expectations and their methods. One response would be to import labor from China. The Ming Dynasty had a large growing population, and emigration could relieve demographic pressure while providing workers for American settlements. Chinese peasants facing poverty or landlessness might be recruited to settle in the Americas, with promises of land and opportunity. This would begin the process of demographic replacement, gradually making the Americas more Chinese in population as well as culture. But large-scale Chinese emigration would not happen immediately. The distance was too great, the voyages too dangerous, and Chinese society had strong cultural prohibitions against leaving ancestral lands. Initial Chinese immigration would likely be limited to merchants, soldiers, administrators, and others with specific roles in the colonial system. The bulk of agricultural labor would still need to come from indigenous populations, making their survival an economic necessity for the Chinese. The Chinese might implement public health measures to try to preserve indigenous populations. They might establish hospitals, distribute medicines, and teach indigenous peoples Chinese medical techniques. Quarantine of sick individuals and communities would be enforced. Food aid might be provided to communities devastated by disease. These measures would be motivated by practical concerns as much as humanitarianism, but they might save some lives. The long-term demographic outcome would be a gradually mixed population. Indigenous peoples, though greatly reduced in numbers, would survive. Chinese immigrants would slowly increase. The two populations would interact, trade, and eventually intermarry, creating a mestizo population that was genetically and culturally hybrid. The process would take centuries, but the eventual result would be an America that was neither purely indigenous nor purely Chinese, but a synthesis. The biological exchange would flow both ways, though less catastrophically for China. The Americas had fewer dangerous pathogens to export, but they did have some. Syphilis, if it indeed originated in the Americas as some scholars believe, would travel back to China, joining the disease environment there. More significantly, American crops would transform Chinese agriculture. The potato, able to grow in marginal lands unsuitable for rice or wheat, would enable expansion of agriculture into highland regions. Maize would become an important secondary crop. These new crops would support population growth in China, just as they did in Europe after the Columbian Exchange. The introduction of American fauna to China would be less transformative, as most American animals were already present in some form in Eurasia. But the turkey might be introduced as a domesticated bird, and the guinea pig might find a place in Chinese animal husbandry. Chinese knowledge of natural history would be expanded by the documentation of American species, from the jaguar to the hummingbird, from the bison to the prairie dog. The environmental exchange would also reshape both continents. Chinese crops and animals would transform American ecosystems. Rice paddies would appear in suitable wetland areas. Pigs would escape and become feral, altering forest ecosystems. European honeybees, brought by Chinese ships, would spread across the continent, benefiting some plants while displacing native pollinators. The cumulative effect would be the creation of neo-ecosystems that combined old and new world species in novel combinations. The disease catastrophe would cast a long shadow over Chinese indigenous relations. Indigenous peoples would associate Chinese presence with death and suffering, even if they understood intellectually that the Chinese were not deliberately causing the epidemics. This would fuel resistance movements and make cooperation more difficult. Chinese officials would struggle to maintain the tributary system when the populations they governed were dying in vast numbers. The crisis would force adaptations on both sides, accelerating cultural exchange as survival became the paramount concern. Historians of this alternate timeline would debate how many indigenous Americans died as a result of Chinese contact. The numbers would be staggering, perhaps 60 to 90 million people, though precise figures would be impossible to determine. Some would argue that Chinese public health measures reduced mortality compared to what might have occurred. Others would counter that Chinese colonization caused the contact that brought disease, making Chinese ultimately responsible regardless of their later mitigation efforts. The debate would echo the similar debates about European colonization in our timeline, with no easy answers. What is certain is that disease would reshape the Americas as profoundly as any political or cultural change. The demographic collapse would empty cities, transform landscapes as agricultural land returned to wilderness, and create a psychological trauma that would be transmitted across generations. The Americas after disease would be a haunted land, filled with the ghosts of the millions who died, and the civilizations that eventually emerged, whether predominantly Chinese, indigenous, or hybrid, would be built on the ashes of this catastrophe. When Europe finally arrives in our alternate timeline, European knowledge of the Americas would be delayed but not prevented indefinitely. Eventually, European explorers would venture into the Atlantic, driven by the same motives that drove them in our history, seeking trade routes to Asia, escaping political or religious persecution, pursuing glory and gold. But they would find a very different Americas than the one Columbus encountered. The most likely European explorers to reach the Americas would still be the Portuguese or Spanish, given their geographic position on the Atlantic coast and their cultural drive toward maritime exploration, but the timing would be different. In our timeline, Spanish exploration was accelerated by the final defeat of the Moorish Kingdom of Granada in 1492, freeing resources and religious energy for exploration. Portuguese exploration was driven by the desire to outflank Muslim control of trade. Routes to Asia, these motivations would still exist in the alternate timeline. Let us imagine that the first European ship reaches the Caribbean around 1520, about a century after Chinese contact. The captain might be Portuguese, seeking a western route to the Spice Islands of Asia, or Spanish, pursuing rumors of lands to the west. When his ship makes landfall, perhaps in the Caribbean islands, he finds not pristine wilderness inhabited by naive populations, but a land already transformed by a century of old world contact. the indigenous Caribbean peoples, the Taino and others, would have experienced Chinese contact through trade networks, even if Chinese ships never reached the islands directly. Chinese goods, porcelain and silk, would be circulating as prestige items. Stories of the powerful strangers from across the ocean would be known. Some Caribbean peoples might have been incorporated into the Chinese tributary system through intermediaries. Others might have remained independent but aware of Chinese presence on the mainland. The European captain would be confused and alarmed by what he found. He expected to be the first Old World visitor to these lands. Instead, he finds evidence of prior contact, goods from an Asian civilization, stories of great ships and powerful foreigners. When he tries to establish a settlement or claim territory for his monarch, he might be told that these lands are already under the protection of the great Ming Emperor. The shock would be profound. The news would travel back to Europe slowly, carried by the few ships that successfully made the return voyage across the Atlantic. When it reached royal courts and merchant houses, it would cause consternation. The Americas, that vast new land that Europeans had dreamed of exploiting, was already claimed by China. The gold and silver they hoped to seize was already flowing to Beijing. The souls they hoped to save for Christianity were already exposed to Buddhism and Confucianism. The colonial project would need to be fundamentally rethought. The European response would depend on the balance of power they found. If Chinese control of the Americas was strong, with multiple settlements, a large military presence, and firm alliances with indigenous populations, Europeans might be shut out entirely from American colonization. They would be limited to trying to establish their own trade relationships with China, buying American goods through Chinese intermediaries. This would be economically frustrating, but might not prevent Europe from developing along similar lines to our timeline, though perhaps more slowly without American silver to fuel its economy. If Chinese presence was weaker, limited to a few coastal settlements with tenuous control over indigenous hinterlands, Europeans might see opportunities for their own colonization. They could establish rival settlements in areas not controlled by China, particularly on the Atlantic coast, far from Chinese Pacific bases. They could ally with indigenous peoples who resented Chinese domination, offering themselves as alternative patrons. This would lead to a complex multipolar colonization, with Chinese, European, and indigenous powers all competing for control. The most likely scenario is somewhere between these extremes. Chinese presence would be strongest on the Pacific coast of the Americas, and in regions close to the major indigenous civilizations of Mexico and Peru. The Atlantic coast, Caribbean, and interior regions would be less firmly under Chinese control. Europeans could establish toeholds in these peripheral regions, gradually expanding as their own naval capabilities improved and their understanding of American geography increased. The competition between Chinese and European colonizers would be fierce. Both would seek alliances with indigenous peoples, offering protection, trade goods, and military support in exchange for loyalty. Indigenous groups would play the two powers against each other, seeking to maximize their own autonomy and advantages. Some indigenous states might maintain independence by balancing between Chinese and European patrons, accepting tributary status with both while maintaining practical sovereignty. The cultural contrast between Chinese and European colonization would be stark. Chinese settlers would bring rice agriculture, Buddhist and Confucian temples, Chinese social organization, and a paternalistic attitude toward indigenous peoples as barbarians who needed civilization but could be improved. Europeans would bring wheat agriculture, Christian missionaries, European class structures, and often a more overtly racist attitude toward indigenous peoples, though with more aggressive evangelization efforts trying to convert them. The religious dimension would become particularly important. China had already been exposed to Christianity through Nestorian and Jesuit missionaries, but had not converted. Christianity was tolerated as one religion among many in the Chinese system. When European missionaries arrived in the Americas and tried to convert indigenous peoples, they would find Chinese Buddhist and Confucian missionaries already there, competing for souls. The result would be a complex religious landscape with indigenous traditional religions persisting alongside Buddhism, Christianity, and syncretic combinations of all three. The disease situation, by the time Europeans arrived, would be very different from our timeline. A century of contact with Chinese diseases would have already killed the most vulnerable populations. The survivors would have some immunity, and the population would have begun recovering from the initial catastrophe. European diseases would still cause epidemics, but not the apocalyptic die-off that occurred historically. This would mean stronger indigenous polities capable of more effective resistance to European colonization. The military balance would also be different. Indigenous peoples, after a century of contact with Chinese military technology, would have acquired firearms, steel weapons, and horses. Some indigenous forces might even have Chinese advisors or Chinese weapons supplied to allied groups. European military advantages would be smaller than in our timeline, making colonization more difficult and costly. Every European foothold would need to be fought for and defended continuously. The geopolitical implications for Europe would be profound. In our timeline, American silver financed Spanish power and fueled European economic development. Without easy access to American wealth, European states would need to find alternative paths to power. This might slow European economic development, delay the rise of capitalism, and prevent or reduce the European dominance of global affairs that characterize the modern era. Or it might force European states to be more efficient and innovative, seeking alternative sources of wealth and power. The scientific and intellectual impact would also be significant. In our timeline, contact with the Americas challenged European assumptions about the world, stimulated scientific inquiry, and provided new plants, animals, and peoples to study. In the alternate timeline, Europe would still experience these intellectual challenges, but filtered through Chinese reports and interpretations. European scientists would need to read Chinese accounts of American nature and civilization, learning Chinese to access this knowledge. This might actually accelerate cultural exchange between Europe and China. The balance of global power in this alternate timeline would shift toward Asia. China, already the world's largest economy, would gain additional resources from the Americas. Chinese technology and institutions would be validated by successful colonization. The narrative of Western superiority that developed in our timeline would never take hold. Instead, the story of modernity might be one of Chinese expansion and innovation, with Europe as a peripheral region struggling to catch up. By 1600, the Americas would be a contested space. The Pacific coast and much of Central and South America would be under Chinese influence, incorporated into the tributary system, with hybrid Chinese indigenous cultures developing. The Atlantic coast and Caribbean would be increasingly penetrated by European colonization, with Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Dutch settlements competing for control. The interior would remain largely indigenous controlled, with various peoples playing Chinese and European powers against each other. The indigenous peoples, though greatly reduced in numbers and facing ongoing pressure from both Chinese and European colonizers, would remain major actors in this story. The Aztec and Inca empires would have transformed, adopting Chinese political forms and technology while maintaining elements of their traditional culture. Other indigenous peoples would have created new political formations, adapted to the colonial situation. All would be struggling to survive and maintain autonomy in a world transformed by Old World contact. The stage would be set for centuries of complex interactions, conflicts, and exchanges. The Americas would not become simply Chinese or European, but would develop as a unique civilization, drawing on indigenous, Chinese, and European sources. The path to modernity would be different. The global balance of power would be reconfigured, and the world we know would never come into existence. Cultural synthesis and the birth of new civilizations. After 2 centuries of contact, by the mid-17th century, the Americas would have developed a distinctive civilization unlike anything that existed in either the Old World or in our timeline. The synthesis of indigenous American, Chinese, and European cultures would create societies that borrowed from all 3 sources but could be reduced to none. These hybrid societies would be creative, complex, and full of internal tensions, but they would also be uniquely adapted to the American environment and its challenges. In the Pacific coastal regions, where Chinese influence was strongest, cities would blend Chinese and indigenous architectural styles. Buildings would use Chinese construction techniques with tiled roofs and wooden frame construction, but incorporate indigenous decorative elements and adapt to local conditions. Temples would serve multiple religions, with Buddhist monks, Confucian scholars, indigenous priests, and even some Christian missionaries all operating in the same urban spaces, each trying to win adherents while coexisting uneasily. The language situation would be complex. Mandarin Chinese would be the language of administration and high culture, necessary for anyone who wanted to advance in the colonial bureaucracy. But indigenous languages would persist for daily communication, especially in rural areas. A pidgin combining Chinese and indigenous vocabulary with simplified grammar would likely develop as a trade language. In coastal cities, people might speak 3 or 4 languages depending on context. Chinese for official business, an indigenous language at home, the pidgin for market transactions, and perhaps some Portuguese or Spanish for dealing with European traders. The writing system would present particular challenges. Chinese characters, developed for a language with very different structure from indigenous American languages, would be difficult to adapt. Some indigenous peoples might adopt Chinese characters phonetically, using them to represent sounds rather than meanings. Others might develop hybrid systems combining Chinese characters with indigenous pictographic or syllabic elements. The result would be tremendous diversity in literacy practices, with no single standard writing system emerging for centuries. Cuisine would be perhaps the most visible and pervasive form of cultural synthesis. Chinese cooking techniques, particularly stir-frying in woks and steaming in bamboo baskets, would be applied to American ingredients. Maize, tomatoes, beans, and chilies would be incorporated into dishes alongside Chinese rice, soy sauce, and noodles. The result would be something genuinely new, neither Chinese nor indigenous, but combining elements of both. Food historians in this timeline would trace the development of regional cuisines that varied tremendously, but all showed the marks of cultural mixing. In the European-controlled Atlantic regions, a different synthesis would occur. European attempts to recreate Old World society would be frustrated by American conditions and the presence of indigenous peoples who could not simply be eliminated. European colonists would need to adapt, adopting American crops like maize and potatoes, which grew better in New World conditions than wheat. They would employ indigenous labor, and unable to import enough European women, would intermarry with indigenous women, creating mestizo populations. But unlike our timeline, where European colonization often proceeded with little regard for indigenous institutions, in the alternate timeline, Europeans would find more organized indigenous resistance backed sometimes by Chinese support. European colonies would be smaller, more precarious, and more dependent on maintaining good relations with indigenous neighbors. The result would be less cultural destruction and more genuine exchange, with Europeans learning from indigenous practices while trying to impose their own. Religion would be the battlefield where cultural conflict was most intense and most visible. Chinese religious tolerance, born of pragmatic statecraft rather than principled pluralism, would allow multiple religions to coexist within the tributary system. Indigenous traditional religions, focused on maintaining cosmic balance and ensuring agricultural fertility, would continue to be practiced openly. Buddhism would spread among some indigenous peoples, particularly the concept of karma and reincarnation, which resonated with existing beliefs. Confucianism would be adopted by indigenous elites who saw its emphasis on hierarchy and filial piety as compatible with their own social structures. Christianity, arriving later and associated with European colonization, would face a more difficult path. Some indigenous peoples would convert enthusiastically, seeing in Christian universalism an alternative to both Chinese paternalism and traditional hierarchies. Christian missionaries would work hard to translate the Bible into indigenous languages, create indigenous clergy, and adapt Christian ritual to local customs. But they would also face competition from Buddhist and Confucian missionaries who had arrived first and already had established institutions. The result would be tremendous religious diversity and syncretism. Some communities might follow a traditional indigenous religion influenced by Buddhist concepts. Others might practice Catholicism mixed with traditional rituals. Still others might develop new syncretic religions that combined elements of multiple traditions. Religious authorities on all sides would struggle to maintain doctrinal purity, but at the popular level, religion would be fluid and pragmatic, with people incorporating whatever beliefs and practices seemed effective. The political organization of the Americas by 1650 would be complex and contested. No single power would dominate the entire continent. Instead, multiple zones of influence would exist, their boundaries shifting through warfare, diplomacy, and indigenous agency. The Pacific coast from California to Chile would be predominantly Chinese in political orientation, with numerous indigenous tributary states governing their own affairs under Chinese oversight. The Caribbean and Atlantic coast of Brazil would be contested between Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English colonial ventures, none strong enough to eliminate the others. The interior of North America would remain indigenous-controlled, with various confederacies and kingdoms trading with both Chinese and Europeans while maintaining their independence. Central America would be particularly complex. The former Aztec Empire, transformed by Chinese influence into a tributary kingdom, would be a major regional power in its own right. The ruler in Tenochtitlan, now a Chinese-style capital with palaces and temples in hybrid architectural styles, would govern millions of subjects. The city itself would be one of the largest in the world, a cosmopolitan center where Chinese officials, indigenous nobles, European merchants, and people from all over the Americas would mingle in markets and government offices. The Inca realm, stretching along the Andes Mountains, would be similarly transformed, but retaining more of its traditional structure. The Sapa Inca would govern as a Chinese tributary king, acknowledged as one of the highest-ranking rulers outside China proper. The incredible Inca road system would be linked to Chinese coastal settlements, creating a commercial network that moved Andean silver and highland agricultural products to the coast in exchange for Chinese manufactured goods and lowland crops. The former Inca capital of Cusco would remain an important city, though possibly eclipsed by a new Chinese-founded port city on the coast that served as the administrative center. Intellectual and artistic life would flourish in this complex cultural environment. Chinese scholars in America would write about indigenous civilizations, trying to fit them into Chinese cosmological and historical frameworks. Were they descended from ancient Chinese explorers? Did their customs show the influence of Confucian or Taoist ideas? These debates would mirror similar debates among indigenous and European intellectuals about the origins and nature of Chinese civilization. Everyone would be trying to understand the others, often unsuccessfully, but producing tremendous amounts of literature in the process. Art would show fascinating combinations of influences. Indigenous artists would learn Chinese painting techniques, particularly landscape painting and calligraphy, applying them to American subjects. The jaguar and eagle would be rendered in styles influenced by Chinese dragon and phoenix imagery. Chinese artists in America would be influenced by indigenous styles, incorporating indigenous motifs and colors into their work. European artistic influences would be added to this mix in the Atlantic regions, creating regional variations. Music would blend indigenous instruments like drums and flutes with Chinese string instruments and European violins and keyboards. New musical traditions would emerge, neither Chinese nor indigenous nor European, but something new. Court music in Tenochtitlan might combine Chinese stringed instruments playing pentatonic melodies with indigenous drums providing rhythm and European brass instruments adding harmonic depth. Popular music would be even more eclectic, drawing on whatever worked and whatever people enjoyed. Literature would face the challenges of multiple languages and writing systems, but this would not prevent creativity. Epic poems would be composed celebrating the achievements of indigenous heroes, written in Chinese characters, but following indigenous poetic conventions. Plays would be performed combining Chinese theatrical traditions with indigenous ritual drama. Historical chronicles would be written trying to integrate Chinese, indigenous, and eventually European historical narratives into coherent accounts. None of this would be easy, and much would be lost in translation, but the effort would produce a rich and diverse literary culture. Education would become a crucial site of cultural transmission and conflict. Chinese authorities would establish schools to train indigenous elites in Chinese language, classics, and administrative practices. These schools would produce a class of indigenous people who were fluent in both their ancestral culture and Chinese civilization, serving as intermediaries and administrators. But they would also produce people who felt caught between worlds, not fully accepted as Chinese, but alienated from their own traditional communities. Indigenous communities would maintain their own educational practices, teaching traditional knowledge, skills, and values to the next generation. European missionary schools would add a third educational model, focused on Christian doctrine and European learning. The role of women in this transformed society would vary greatly by region and class. In Chinese-influenced areas, women would face the constraints of Chinese patriarchal culture, though indigenous traditions often gave women more autonomy than Chinese custom allowed. The result would be negotiated compromises, with women's status varying by class and ethnicity. Elite Chinese women in American cities would be expected to follow Chinese norms of seclusion and subordination. Indigenous women, especially those who married Chinese men, would navigate between Chinese expectations and their own cultural traditions. European colonial areas would impose their own patriarchal systems, but again, indigenous traditions would persist and modify European practices. The economic systems would be equally hybrid. Chinese commercial practices, including paper money, credit instruments, and organized markets, would be introduced alongside indigenous forms of exchange. In indigenous communities, traditional practices like reciprocal gift-giving and communal labor would persist but be integrated with Chinese tax collection and trade networks. European colonial areas would develop their own economic systems based on European models but adapted to American conditions. The result would be a complex patchwork of economic practices, with people learning to operate in multiple systems simultaneously. By the mid-17th century, a new generation would be coming of age, born into this hybrid world and knowing nothing else. For them, the presence of Chinese officials, the mixture of languages and religions, the blending of cultural practices, all would be normal. They would not think of themselves as either Chinese or indigenous, but as something new. In the Chinese-controlled regions, they might call themselves people of the Eastern Ocean territories, subjects of the Ming Emperor, but distinct from Chinese in China proper. In other regions, other identities would emerge, each specific to local circumstances. These emerging identities would be the foundation for the eventual independence movements that would come centuries later. Just as Creole populations in European colonies eventually demanded independence, the hybrid populations of Chinese America would eventually seek autonomy from Beijing. But that is a story for a later chapter of history. In the 17th century, Chinese control was still firm, and the colonial system was still expanding and evolving. The transformation of China itself. The discovery and colonization of the Americas would transform China as profoundly as it transformed the Americas, though in very different ways. The influx of American silver, the introduction of American crops, the validation of maritime expansion, and the need to administer vast territories across the Pacific would reshape Chinese economy, society, and politics over the course of 2 centuries. The most immediate impact would be economic. American silver, mined initially by indigenous labor using traditional methods, and later by more intensive Chinese-directed operations, would flow to China in quantities that dwarfed the historical silver trade from Japan and other sources. Silver was crucial to the Chinese economy because China was the only major economy that used silver as the primary medium of exchange. The influx of American silver would stimulate Chinese economic growth, facilitate trade, and allow for expansion of the money supply. But the economic effects would not be entirely positive. The sudden increase in silver supply would cause inflation, reducing the purchasing power of existing silver holdings and disrupting price relationships throughout the economy. Chinese economic historians would debate whether the American silver boom helped or hurt the Chinese economy, with some arguing it stimulated growth and others contending it caused harmful inflation and economic instability. The truth, as usual, would be complex, with different regions and classes experiencing different effects. The introduction of American crops would have even more far-reaching consequences. The potato, capable of growing in mountainous regions unsuitable for rice or wheat, would enable agricultural expansion into previously marginal lands. The population of China, already large, would grow even more rapidly as food supplies increased. Maize would become an important secondary crop, particularly in drier regions. Sweet potatoes would be widely adopted, especially in southern China. These American crops would support population growth that would eventually create its own problems. But in the short term, they would seem like miraculous solutions to food security challenges. The tobacco plant, brought from the Americas, would be enthusiastically adopted by Chinese farmers and consumers. Tobacco cultivation would spread rapidly, and smoking would become a popular habit across Chinese society, despite periodic official disapproval. The long-term health consequences would be terrible, but in the short term, tobacco would be seen as a beneficial. Chinese agriculture would be transformed by the global exchange of crops and techniques. Chinese farmers in America would experiment with new combinations of crops, developing hybrid agricultural systems. These innovations would be brought back to China by returning officials and merchants, spreading new techniques throughout the empire. Chinese agricultural treatises would be updated to include American crops, their characteristics, cultivation requirements, and uses. The cumulative effect would be a more diverse and productive agricultural system. The administrative challenge of governing American territories would strain and eventually transform Chinese political institutions. The distance between Beijing and the Americas was so great that regular communication took months. American governors would necessarily have considerable autonomy, making decisions without waiting for imperial approval. This decentralization would be at odds with the centralizing tendencies of Chinese imperial government, creating tensions that would need to be managed. The solution would likely be the creation of a separate American viceroyalty or administration with authority to govern the Americas subject to general imperial directives but with day-to-day autonomy. The viceroy would be one of the most powerful officials in the empire, governing territories larger than China itself and commanding resources that rivaled the imperial treasury. The position would be prestigious and dangerous, attracting ambitious officials who saw it as a path to wealth and power, but also risking the wrath of emperors, suspicious of overmighty subjects. The military implications would also be significant. Maintaining control over the Americas would require a permanent Chinese military presence, including naval forces to control sea lanes and ground forces to suppress rebellions and deter European encroachment. This military establishment would be expensive, but it would also create opportunities for military innovation. Chinese military forces in America, facing different enemies and terrain than in Asia, would develop new tactics and technologies. Some of these innovations would be transferred back to China, improving Chinese military capabilities generally. The intellectual and cultural impact on China would be profound. Chinese scholars would be fascinated by the existence of a vast continent and sophisticated civilizations that were previously unknown. This would challenge Chinese geographical and cosmological assumptions. If the Americas existed and were not mentioned in Chinese classics, what else might the classics have missed? The discovery would stimulate geographical inquiry, cartography, and natural history. Chinese scholars would write extensive accounts of American geography, peoples, flora, and fauna, expanding Chinese knowledge of the world dramatically. The existence of indigenous American civilizations would raise philosophical questions. Were they also capable of civilization? Did they have the same human nature as Chinese? How did they fit into the Confucian understanding of human society? The answers would vary, with some scholars arguing that indigenous Americans proved the universality of human nature, and others contending they were fundamentally different from Chinese. These debates would echo and inform Chinese thinking about other non-Chinese peoples, potentially making Chinese culture more or less universalist, depending on how the debates resolved. Chinese art and literature would be enriched by American themes and materials. Painters would depict American landscapes, trying to capture the grandeur of mountain ranges and the exotic quality of tropical forests. American animals, from the jaguar to the hummingbird, would appear in paintings and decorative arts. Literature would include accounts of travels in America, chronicles of Chinese adventures in strange lands, and eventually fictional works set in America. A genre of American adventure literature might develop, romanticizing the colonial experience and celebrating Chinese civilization's expansion. The religious landscape in China might also be affected. Buddhism and Taoism, already well established, would gain new adherents among Chinese who traveled to America and found these traditions helpful in making sense of their experiences. Christianity, arriving in China through Jesuit missionaries in our timeline, might have different fortunes in the alternate timeline. If Chinese in America encountered Christianity through indigenous converts or European missionaries there, their understanding of Christianity might be different from the Jesuit presentation. This might make Christianity more or less acceptable to Chinese authorities, depending on the specific circumstances. The social impact would be equally significant. Thousands of Chinese would emigrate to America, seeking opportunity or fleeing problems at home. These emigrants would include merchants, farmers, artisans, laborers, and criminals being transported as punishment. They would establish Chinese communities in American cities and countryside, maintaining connections to China, but also adapting to American conditions. When they returned to China, as many would, they would bring American influences with them, gradually changing Chinese society from within. The merchant class would be particular beneficiaries of the American trade. Chinese merchants who organized trade between China and America would become fabulously wealthy, accumulating fortunes that rivaled those of the highest officials. This would enhance the status of merchants in Chinese society, which traditionally ranked them below scholars and farmers. The influx of commercial wealth might accelerate the commercialization and commodification of Chinese society, processes that were already underway in the Ming Dynasty, but which American trade would intensify. The imperial government would benefit from increased revenues from American tribute and trade taxes. This additional income would allow for expanded government projects, from infrastructure development to military expansion to patronage of arts and learning. But it would also create new opportunities for corruption, as officials involved in American affairs would have access to tremendous wealth. The history of the American administration would likely include cycles of corruption and reform, as emperors tried to maintain control over their distant American territories and the officials who governed them. the environmental impact on China would be subtle but real. American plants and animals introduced to China would sometimes become invasive, disrupting ecosystems. The silver mines of America would require timber for shoring and smelting, leading to deforestation in mining regions. The increased trade would mean more ships, more shipbuilding, and more demand for timber, affecting Chinese forests. Pollution from increased industrial and commercial activity would worsen, particularly in port cities handling American trade. These environmental consequences would not be understood at the time, but they would accumulate over decades and centuries. The geopolitical position of China would be transformed. With control over much of the Americas, China would be a truly global empire, the first such empire in human history. Chinese power would extend across the Pacific, making China the dominant power in that ocean. This would affect Chinese relations with all other powers, from Japan to the various Southeast Asian kingdoms to European states. China would be even more confident of its superiority, its successful colonization of the Americas seeming to prove the superiority of Chinese civilization. But this confidence might breed complacency. The wealth flowing from America might reduce incentives for innovation and reform in China. If American silver and crops solved immediate economic problems, Chinese authorities might see less need to undertake difficult institutional reforms. This could leave China vulnerable in the long term, even as it appeared strong in the short term. The dynamics of empire would be complex, with strengths and weaknesses often interconnected. By the 18th century, China would be a different civilization than in our timeline. Transformed by 2 centuries of American colonization, it would be wealthier, more diverse, more globally engaged, and more confident. But it would also face new challenges, from managing distant territories, to assimilating new foods and ideas, to maintaining legitimacy in the face of American colonials, who might eventually demand autonomy or independence. The story of Chinese modernity would be inseparable from the story of Chinese America, the two regions shaping each other across the Pacific Ocean. The road to independence and modern nations by the late 18th century. The same forces that led to independence movements in European American colonies would begin stirring in Chinese America. The distance from the imperial capital, the growth of local identities, the resentment of taxation and control from afar, the influence of Enlightenment ideas about self-governance and natural rights. All of these would eventually create pressure for independence. But the form this took would be very different from our timelines. American Revolution or Latin American independence movements. The key difference would be that Chinese American colonial societies were not predominantly settler colonies. While Chinese immigration had been significant, the majority of the population in most regions would still be indigenous or mixed indigenous Chinese. This would mean that independence movements would need to accommodate multiple ethnic and cultural groups, each with different relationships to Chinese imperial authority. In the Pacific coastal regions, where Chinese influence was strongest, a class of Creoles had emerged by the 18th century. These were people of mixed Chinese and indigenous ancestry, or Chinese born in America, or indigenous people educated in Chinese culture. They identified with America rather than China, resented being governed by officials sent from Beijing, and wanted control over their own affairs. They spoke Chinese and followed Chinese customs, but they also incorporated indigenous and local elements into their identity. They would be the leaders of independence movements in these regions. The intellectual justification for independence would draw on multiple sources. Confucian thought, ironically, would provide arguments for justified rebellion against unjust rule. The Confucian concept of the mandate of heaven held that rulers lost legitimacy if they governed badly. American Creoles could argue that the Ming or Qing dynasty had lost the mandate in America by governing from afar without understanding local conditions. This would be a Confucian justification for independence, using Chinese political philosophy against Chinese imperial claims. European Enlightenment ideas would also filter into Chinese America through trade and intellectual exchange. The concepts of natural rights, social contract, and popular sovereignty would be translated into Chinese and indigenous languages, debated in salons and academies, and adapted to American circumstances. These ideas would provide an alternative vocabulary for independence, one based on universal human rights rather than Chinese traditions. The combination of Confucian and Enlightenment arguments would make independence movements intellectually sophisticated and difficult for Beijing to dismiss as mere barbarism. The actual path to independence would likely be gradual and regional rather than a single dramatic break. Different parts of Chinese America would have different relationships with the imperial center and different levels of Chinese control. Some regions might gain effective independence through neglect, as Beijing's attention and resources were focused elsewhere. Others might negotiate autonomy within a looser imperial framework. Still others might fight wars of independence against Chinese military forces. The catalyst might be a succession crisis or period of weakness in China itself. If the imperial government faced internal rebellions, foreign invasions, or dynastic collapse, its ability to maintain control over distant American territories would be compromised. American colonial leaders might see this as an opportunity to assert independence, knowing that China lacked the resources to reassert control. The timing would depend on specific circumstances in China that we cannot predict with certainty. Imagine an independence movement beginning in Central America around 1800. The leader might be a Creole official or military officer of mixed Chinese Aztec descent, educated in Confucian classics, but also exposed to indigenous traditions and European ideas. He issues a declaration that combines elements of all three traditions. Confucian arguments that the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven in America, Enlightenment assertions of natural rights and self-governance, and indigenous claims to ancestral lands. The declaration calls for the creation of an independent American empire, not rejecting Chinese civilization, but claiming the right to govern themselves according to Chinese principles adapted to American circumstances. The response from Beijing would depend on its own situation. A strong emperor with resources to spare might send a military expedition to crush the rebellion and reassert control. A weak emperor facing domestic crises might be forced to accept independence as a fait accompli. The most likely scenario would be somewhere in between, with military expeditions achieving limited success, negotiated settlements granting some autonomy while maintaining nominal Chinese sovereignty, and a long process of separation, taking decades rather than years. The indigenous peoples would play crucial roles in these independence movements, but their interests would not always align with Creole leaders. Some indigenous groups might support independence, hoping it would give them more autonomy from both Chinese and Creole elites. Others might remain loyal to Chinese authority, fearing that independent Creole-dominated governments would be more oppressive than distant Chinese rule. Still others might see the chaos of independence movements as an opportunity to reassert their own independence from all outside control. The result would be complex multi-sided conflicts with shifting alliances. The geography of independence would matter enormously. The Pacific coastal regions, closest to Chinese power and most integrated into the Chinese economy, would be hardest to separate from Chinese control. The interior regions, where Chinese control had always been more tenuous, might achieve independence more easily. The result might be multiple independent states rather than a single unified nation, each with its own character depending on local ethnic composition, economic base, and relationship to both indigenous and Chinese traditions. The constitution-making process in these new nations would be fascinating. The founders would need to create political systems that drew on Chinese, indigenous, and European traditions while adapting to American circumstances. They might create mixed systems with a Chinese-style bureaucracy for administration, Confucian examinations for selecting officials, but also elected assemblies representing different ethnic groups and regions. The balance between centralization and local autonomy, between meritocracy and representation, between different cultural traditions, would be difficult to achieve and would generate ongoing political conflict. The relationship between the new American nations and China would remain important even after independence. Trade would continue, cultural exchange would persist, and many American Creoles would still identify with Chinese civilization even while governing independent nations. China might recognize American independence grudgingly, but maintain cultural and commercial ties. Chinese migration to America might actually increase after independence, as restrictions were relaxed and opportunities expanded. The result would be ongoing Chinese influence on American development, even without direct political control. The indigenous peoples, having navigated centuries of Chinese colonization, would face new challenges and opportunities in the post-independence era. In some regions, indigenous peoples would be integrated into the new nations as full citizens, their rights protected by constitutions that acknowledge the multi-ethnic nature of American societies. In other regions, they would face continued marginalization, or even new forms of colonization by Creole elites, who no longer feared Chinese oversight. The outcomes would vary tremendously by region and would be the subject of ongoing political struggle. The economic development of independent Chinese American nations would take distinctive paths. They would have industrial technologies and commercial practices inherited from China, but they would also face the challenges of building independent economies no longer guaranteed access to Chinese markets. They might develop their own industries, competing with China and European powers. They might specialize in producing raw materials and agricultural products for export. They might create economic unions among themselves to increase their collective power. The specific choices would depend on local resources, political leadership, and global economic conditions. By the 19th century, the Americas would be divided among multiple independent nations of varying sizes, power, and character. Some would be predominantly Chinese in culture, with significant indigenous minorities. Others would be more balanced between Chinese and indigenous influences, creating truly hybrid cultures. Still others might be predominantly indigenous with Chinese minorities. European colonies would persist on the Atlantic coast and Caribbean, eventually following their own paths to independence and creating their own distinctive societies. These American nations would interact with each other, sometimes peacefully through trade and diplomacy, sometimes violently through border conflicts and wars. They would relate to China as independent powers, sending ambassadors, negotiating treaties, and asserting their equality in the international system. They would interact with European powers and other regions of the world, taking their place in the global order as sovereign nations. Their paths to modernity would be neither simply Chinese, nor simply European, nor simply indigenous, but synthesize all three in distinctive ways. The world in 2025, a transformed present now. We must attempt the most speculative and vertiginous part of our journey, imagining the present day in a world where China discovered America first. 6 centuries of history, thousands of decisions, millions of lives, all would have unfolded differently. The compound interest of alternate history makes specific predictions impossible, but we can identify broad patterns and likely outcomes that would distinguish this world from ours. The most obvious difference would be the linguistic landscape of the Americas. In our timeline, Spanish, Portuguese, and English dominate the Western Hemisphere, with indigenous languages persisting in diminished form. In the alternate timeline, Mandarin Chinese would be the dominant prestige language across much of the Pacific Americas, from California to Chile. But this would not mean linguistic uniformity. Indigenous languages, having had more time to adapt to Chinese influence rather than being suddenly replaced, would have evolved into literary and administrative languages with Chinese vocabulary and sometimes Chinese characters adapted to their phonology. The result would be a linguistic landscape of tremendous diversity. In Mexico, the dominant language might be a Nahuatl-Mandarin hybrid, with Spanish as a minority language on the Atlantic coast. This language would use Chinese characters to write, but its grammar and much of its vocabulary would be indigenous. Political speeches, literary works, and daily conversations would flow in this hybrid tongue, incomprehensible to speakers of either pure Mandarin or classical Nahuatl, but functional and expressive for those who grew up with it. Similar hybrid languages would exist throughout the Americas, each unique to its region. The political geography would be fundamentally different. In our timeline, two large nations, the United States and Brazil, dominate the Americas, with numerous smaller nations filling in the rest. In the alternate timeline, the pattern would be more fragmented and diverse. The former Chinese colonial territories on the Pacific might have unified into several large nations, perhaps 3 or 4, each multi-ethnic and spanning thousands of miles. These would be major world powers in their own right, with populations in the hundreds of millions, resources to match, and sophisticated political systems drawing on Chinese bureaucratic traditions. The Atlantic regions, colonized later and more thinly by Europeans, might be divided into more numerous smaller nations, some predominantly European in culture, others mixed, still others predominantly indigenous. The interior of North America might be controlled by indigenous nations that had successfully maintained independence through centuries of pressure, adapting technologies and institutions from both Chinese and European sources while maintaining their distinctive identities. The Great Plains might be dominated by indigenous confederacies of mounted warriors who had acquired horses and firearms early and used them to build powerful military societies. The global balance of power would be fundamentally different. China, having successfully colonized the Americas and integrated them into its economic system, would be even more dominant than it was historically. Chinese technology, enriched by cross-cultural exchange with indigenous Americans and Europeans, might have developed differently, perhaps maintaining a lead over European development that in our timeline was eventually reversed. The Industrial Revolution, if it occurred, might have started in China or in the Americas rather than in Britain. Europe, by contrast, would be less dominant than in our timeline. Without easy access to American wealth, European states would have been less able to finance their competition for global dominance. The colonial empires that European powers built in Africa and Asia might be smaller or non-existent. Instead, China might be the great colonial power, with European states as secondary players. The narrative of Western ascendancy that has shaped the modern world would never have developed. Instead, the modern era would be understood as the triumph of Chinese civilization and its spread across the globe. The religious landscape of the Americas would be fascinatingly diverse. Buddhism would be a major world religion, with hundreds of millions of adherents in the Americas, having had centuries to adapt to American contexts and indigenous sensibilities. American Buddhism would likely be quite different from Asian Buddhism, incorporating indigenous concepts and practices. Christianity would be present, but less dominant than in our timeline, one option among many rather than the default religion. Indigenous religions, having had more time to adapt and less pressure to convert, would remain vital, sometimes in pure forms and sometimes in syncretic combinations with Buddhism or Christianity. The racial categories that structured social hierarchy in our timeline would be very different. The stark black-white binary of North America and the complex racial hierarchies of Latin America would not exist in the same form. Instead, hierarchies would be based on different categories: Chinese versus non-Chinese, degree of Chinese cultural fluency, mixed ancestry of various types. But 6 centuries of intermarriage and cultural mixing would have created populations where these categories were fluid and complex. Racial ideology would exist, as it seems to wherever diverse populations interact in hierarchical contexts, but its specific forms and meanings would be alien to us. The question of democracy and human rights would have followed a different trajectory. The Chinese tradition did not emphasize individual rights in the same way as European Enlightenment thought. Confucian political philosophy emphasized benevolent government and meritocracy rather than popular sovereignty. American nations descended from Chinese colonization might have developed political systems that were less individualistic and more communitarian than in our timeline, with more emphasis on duties and social harmony than on rights and freedoms. But this does not mean these societies would be unfree or totalitarian. Chinese political tradition also included concepts of justified resistance to unjust rule, the importance of moral governance, and the value of diverse opinions. American nations might have developed forms of democracy that incorporated Confucian meritocracy, selecting leaders through examinations and peer review rather than pure popular voting. Or they might have developed hybrid systems with elements of both traditions. The specific outcomes would depend on centuries of political evolution we cannot predict. Technology and science in this alternate 2025 would have developed along different paths. The scientific revolution and subsequent technological development were shaped by specific cultural, economic, and intellectual circumstances in Europe. In a world where China was the dominant global power and cultural influence, scientific development might have emphasized different questions and methods. Perhaps Chinese interests in holistic medicine, correlative thinking, and practical application would have shaped scientific inquiry more than European interests in reductionism, mechanism, and theoretical elegance. This might mean that some technologies we take for granted would not exist or would exist in different forms. The computer revolution, for instance, was built on specific developments in mathematics and engineering that occurred in Europe and America in our timeline. In the alternate timeline, computing might have developed differently, perhaps using different logical systems or computational methods, or perhaps the Chinese abacus tradition would have led to different approaches to mechanical calculation. The specific technologies of 2025 would be alien to us, though the underlying principles of using technology to extend human capabilities would remain. The environmental challenges facing this alternate 2025 would be broadly similar to those in our timeline. Climate change from greenhouse gas emissions would still be a pressing concern, as industrial development anywhere would produce similar environmental impacts. But the specific patterns of development, the geographic distribution of industry, and the cultural frameworks for understanding environmental issues would all be different. Perhaps Chinese philosophical traditions emphasizing harmony between humans and nature would have created different environmental policies, or perhaps economic pressures would have overridden such concerns, just as they have in our timeline. Popular culture in this alternate present would be a wonderful mixture. Music would combine Chinese tonal systems and pentatonic scales with indigenous rhythms and melodies and European harmonies. Film and television would come from multiple cultural centers, with Chinese American, European American, and indigenous American productions all competing for audiences. Fashion would blend Chinese styles with indigenous aesthetics and European influences, creating regional variations that reflected local cultural mixes. Sports would include Chinese martial arts, indigenous ball games, and European sports, all adapted to American contexts. The cuisine of the Americas would be magnificent, the product of 6 centuries of synthesis. Chinese cooking techniques and ingredients, indigenous American crops and flavors, and European contributions would have merged into distinctive regional cuisines that borrowed from all three, but belonged to none. A meal in Mexico City might include stir-fried nopales with ginger and soy sauce, tamales filled with duck and shiitake mushrooms, and a dessert of sweet potato candied in Chinese style. In Lima, ceviche might be prepared with soy sauce and sesame oil alongside the traditional lime and chili. The internet and global communication networks, if they existed in recognizable form, would connect this diverse world, allowing instant communication across oceans and continents. But the content flowing through these networks would be different from our internet. Mandarin, and various Chinese indigenous hybrid languages would dominate online content. Social media platforms might be organized around different principles, perhaps emphasizing collective harmony over individual expression, or perhaps developing their own distinctive patterns. The global culture emerging from these networks would be recognizably modern, but strange in its specifics. Universities and research institutions would be distributed differently across the globe. The great universities of our timeline, Oxford, Harvard, the Sorbonne, might be less prominent or non-existent. Instead, the prestigious institutions might be in Beijing, in the major cities of Chinese America, perhaps in indigenous cities that had become centers of learning. The curriculum would emphasize different texts and traditions, with Confucian classics alongside indigenous knowledge systems and European works all studied as part of a global heritage. Scholarship would be multilingual and multicultural in ways that go beyond what we have achieved. The question of whether this world would be better or worse than ours is ultimately unanswerable. By almost any metric we choose, some people and places would be better off and others worse off. Indigenous peoples might have suffered less complete cultural destruction, but they would still have faced colonization and disease. Chinese dominance might have been less overtly racist than European dominance, but it would still have been imperial domination. The specific configuration of justice and injustice, freedom and oppression, wealth and poverty, would be different, but not necessarily better or worse in aggregate. What we can say with certainty is that this world would challenge many assumptions we hold about the inevitability of Western dominance, the universality of European cultural forms, and the natural progression of history. It would show that modernity could have taken many forms, that no single civilization has a monopoly on progress or civilization, and that the world we inhabit is the result of countless contingencies, rather than inevitable destiny. The individuals living in this alternate 2025 would find their world as natural and inevitable as we find ours. They would have their own problems and challenges, their own hopes and dreams, their own debates about how to build a better future. They would not pine for our timeline, because they would not know it exists. They would simply be living their lives, shaped by a history that began when Chinese ships crossed the Pacific 6 centuries earlier. Reflections on contingency and possibility. As we come to the end of this long journey through an alternate history, we must step back and reflect on what this exercise reveals about our own world and the nature of history itself. The question, what if China had discovered America first, is not merely a game of imagination, though imagination has been essential to our exploration. It is a way of understanding how profoundly contingent our world is, how many times history could have turned in different directions, and how the world we take for granted might never have existed at all. The technology existed for China to reach the Americas in the early 15th century. Chinese ships were superior to European vessels in every measurable way. Chinese navigation was more advanced. Chinese resources were vastly greater. The fact that China did not discover America was not due to any inherent superiority of European civilization or inevitability of European expansion. It was the result of specific political decisions made in Beijing, the triumph of Confucian bureaucrats over maritime adventurers, the inward turn that abandoned the treasure fleets. Those decisions could have been different: a longer-lived emperor, a different balance of factions at court, even the chance survival or death of key individuals, and history would have turned another direction. This should make us humble about our own place in history. We often tell stories about the rise of the West, the triumph of democracy, the spread of freedom, as if these were inevitable outcomes of historical development. We see the present as the culmination of progress, the end result of a process that had to unfold as it did. But the alternate history we have explored reveals this for the comforting fiction it is. There was nothing inevitable about Western dominance. It was the result of contingent circumstances, not destiny. the indigenous peoples of the Americas might have faced a very different colonization, one led by China rather than Europe. Would this have been better or worse for them? The question is impossible to answer definitively, but exploring it forces us to recognize that colonization was not a uniquely European phenomenon. Many civilizations have expanded and conquered when they had the opportunity. What varied was the specific form this took, the ideologies that justified it, the technologies and institutions used to implement it. Chinese colonization would have been different from European colonization, but it would still have been colonization, with all the violence, exploitation, and cultural destruction that entails. At the same time, the alternate history reveals that cultural exchange and synthesis are possible even within colonial contexts. The hybrid Chinese indigenous cultures we imagined developing in the Americas would have been products of colonization, but they would also have been genuinely creative and new. Culture is not a zero-sum game where the presence of one tradition necessarily means the elimination of another. Even under oppression, people find ways to adapt, resist, and create meaning. The mestizo cultures of our timeline's Latin America, which emerged from Spanish colonization, are testament to this resilience. The Chinese indigenous cultures of the alternate timeline would have been equally creative in their own distinctive ways. The question of democracy and human rights in this alternate timeline raises profound questions about whether these values are culturally specific or universal. Western political thought has often assumed that liberal democracy is the natural endpoint of political development, what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. But Chinese political traditions, equally sophisticated and refined over centuries, emphasize different values. If Chinese civilization had shaped modernity, would we still have arrived at democracy and human rights? Or would we have developed alternative political systems that provided legitimate governance without Western-style individualism? The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. The desire for dignity, autonomy, and voice in governance seems to be universal, even if the specific institutional forms that embody these desires vary across cultures. An alternate modernity, shaped by Chinese influence, might have developed its own forms of accountability and popular participation, different from Western democracy, but serving similar fundamental human needs. Or perhaps indigenous American political traditions, which often emphasized consensus and participation, would have contributed to hybrid political systems that combined elements from multiple sources. The environmental implications of this alternate history remind us that the ecological crisis we face is not simply a result of Western capitalism or industrialization, but of the more fundamental challenge of reconciling human development with ecological limits. Whether colonization was led by China or Europe, whether industrialization began in Beijing or London, the basic pattern of using increasing amounts of energy and resources to drive economic growth would likely have emerged. The specific timeline and geographic distribution might have been different, but the underlying challenge would remain. This suggests that solving environmental problems requires more than changing political or economic systems. It requires a fundamental rethinking of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The question of how this alternate history might have unfolded after the initial centuries of colonization is ultimately unknowable. Too many variables, too much chaos, too many individual decisions that could go either way. We can trace broad patterns and likely trajectories, but specific events become impossible to predict. Would there have been world wars in this alternate 20th century? What would have caused them? Who would have fought them? These questions have no answers, only speculation. What we can say is that by 2025, the world would be fundamentally different from ours. The language you are hearing these words in would not exist in the same form. The political entities that govern the world would have different names, different borders, different characters. The technologies we rely on would be different. The cultural references we share would be alien. The fundamental assumptions we make about how the world works would be challenged. Even the questions we think are important would be different questions. Yet for all these differences, the fundamental human experiences would remain recognizable. People would still fall in love, raise children, pursue meaning, face death. They would still create art, seek knowledge, build communities. They would still struggle within. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of alternate history. It reveals that while culture, politics, technology, and institutions vary enormously across time and place, certain fundamental aspects of human experience persist. We are shaped by our circumstances, but not entirely determined by them. We inherit traditions, but also transform them. We face constraints, but also exercise agency within those constraints. History is neither completely contingent, with everything possible, nor completely determined, with only one path available. It is the interplay of structure and agency, constraint and possibility, inheritance and innovation. The world we have imagined in this alternate history would have its own injustices to overcome, its own challenges to face, its own future to create. The people living in it would not be looking backward, wishing for our timeline, any more than we spend our time wishing we lived in some other version of history. They would be focused on their present and their future, working with the materials history had given them to build something better, just as we are doing in our own timeline, with our own inherited circumstances, facing our own challenges. The exploration of what might have been teaches us to hold our own history more lightly, to recognize that the present is not inevitable and the future is not determined. The Chinese ships that might have sailed east but instead turned back, the political decisions that closed China to maritime exploration, the chance events that allowed Europe to dominate global exploration. All of these remind us that history turns on small moments and could have turned differently. This should give us hope, because it means our own moment is similarly open, similarly full of possibility. The future is not foreordained, but being created by choices we make, individually and collectively. Conclusion: the paths not taken, the moon sets over the Pacific Ocean, that vast expanse of water that has been the stage for our alternate history. In our imagination, we have watched Chinese treasure ships cross these waters, carrying the dragon banner of the Ming Dynasty to shores that Europeans would not reach for another century. We have seen indigenous peoples encounter a civilization utterly foreign to their experience, watched disease and conquest transform the Americas, followed the synthesis of cultures over centuries, traced the emergence of new nations and new identities. It was a plausible path, one that required only a few different decisions in 15th century Beijing. The Yongle Emperor could have lived longer, maintaining his support for maritime expansion. The Confucian bureaucrats could have lost their political battle with the eunuch admirals. A storm could have blown ships off course, leading them accidentally to discover lands to the east. Any of these small changes, and the great treasure fleets might have continued sailing, might have pushed into the unknown Pacific, might have found the Americas, while Europe was still a generation or more away from the technology and organization required for oceanic exploration. The world that would have resulted from Chinese discovery of the Americas would have been radically different from ours. The Americas would speak different languages, follow different religions, organize their societies according to different principles. China would be even more dominant in global affairs than it was historically. Its successful colonization validating its civilization's superiority in ways that would shape modern geopolitics. Europe would be a secondary power, perhaps never experiencing the dominance that characterized the modern era in our timeline. Indigenous peoples would have faced a different colonization, one less overtly racist but still devastating, leaving them transformed, but perhaps not quite as utterly dominated as they were by European powers. The technologies, institutions, cultures, and individuals of this alternate 2025 would be strange to us, products of 6 centuries of different development. We could not predict the specific details with any confidence, because the butterfly effect of alternate history makes precision impossible over such timescales. But we can see the broad patterns, the likely trajectories, the fundamental differences that would distinguish that world from ours. And in seeing those differences, we learn something valuable about our own world. We learn that Western dominance was not inevitable, that modernity could have taken many forms, that the political and cultural forms we sometimes assume are universal are actually historically contingent. We learn that colonization, while taking different forms in different contexts, seems to be a recurring pattern whenever powerful civilizations encounter weaker ones. We learn that human creativity and resilience persists, even under oppression, producing new cultural syntheses from the materials at hand. We learn that the future is not determined by the past, that history turns on choices and chances, and that different choices would have created different worlds. This should make us both humble and hopeful. Humble, because the world we inhabit is not the inevitable culmination of progress, but one possibility among many that happen to occur. The achievements we celebrate, the institutions we revere, the cultures we participate in, all of these might never have existed if history had turned slightly differently 6 centuries ago. Our world is precious, not because it was inevitable, but because it is contingent, fragile, the result of countless choices that could have gone differently, but also hopeful, because if the past was not determined, then neither is the future. We are not trapped by historical inevitability, forced to accept that things must continue as they have been. The same contingency that could have created a world of Chinese-dominated Americas, hybrid cultures, and alternative modernities also means that our future is open. The choices we make, individually and collectively, will shape what comes next. History is not over, and the next chapter is yet to be written. The question of what if China had discovered America first leads us to deeper questions about power, culture, and human possibility. Who gets to shape history and by what means? How do different civilizations interact when they meet? And what determines whether the encounter is primarily violent or creative? Can genuine cultural synthesis occur within colonial contexts, or does domination always destroy more than it creates? Are certain political forms, like democracy, universally valuable or culturally specific? How much does material development depend on specific cultural contexts, and how much does it follow universal patterns? These questions matter not just for understanding alternate histories, but for navigating our own present and future. As we face the challenges of our own era, from climate change to inequality, to the ongoing legacies of colonialism, to the question of how diverse peoples can live together in justice and peace, the alternate history we have explored offers both warnings and possibilities. It warns us that no civilization has a monopoly on virtue or wisdom, that powerful nations tend to dominate weaker ones regardless of their cultural traditions, that disease and environmental change care nothing for our political or cultural preferences. But it also suggests possibilities for synthesis, for creative adaptation, for building something new from diverse materials. The treasure ships of Admiral Zheng He turned back, and Europe sailed west instead. That single fact, the result of political choices in 15th century China, shaped everything that followed. The Americas were colonized by Europeans, not Chinese. Western civilization spread globally rather than remaining regional. The modern world was built on foundations of European thought, European institutions, European power. For better and worse, that is the world we inhabit, the world that shapes our lives and our possibilities. But in the quiet hours of the night, when imagination is free to wander, we can glimpse the other worlds that might have been. We can see the treasure ships continuing eastward, pushing into unknown waters, finding a new continent. We can watch as Chinese and indigenous civilizations encounter each other, clash and synthesize, destroy and create. We can trace the centuries of development, the emergence of hybrid cultures, the eventual independence movements, the distinctive modernity that might have emerged. These are not our world, but they are possible worlds. Roads not taken. Futures that never happened. And in contemplating these alternative possibilities, we understand our own world more deeply. We see that what we take for granted is actually contingent. We recognize that the present was not inevitable. We grasp that the future is still being created. We appreciate the specific beauties and achievements of our timeline while acknowledging its injustices and failures. We hold our own history with both reverence and criticism, honoring what came before while working to create something better. The Pacific Ocean stretches vast and empty in the moonlight, its waters concealing depths we can barely fathom. Somewhere in the currents and tides of that great ocean, in the patterns of wind and wave that have shaped human movement for millennia, lie the paths not taken, the routes the treasure ships might have followed, the landfalls they might have made, the histories they might have created. These alternate paths exist now only in imagination, but that imagination helps us understand that history is not a single track. As this long night journey comes to its end, as the first light of dawn begins to touch the eastern horizon, we return from the realm of what might have been to the world that is. The Americas speak Spanish and English and Portuguese, with indigenous languages surviving in the margins. Western political and economic systems dominate globally, though increasingly challenged. The legacies of European colonization, both its achievements and its crimes, shape our present. This is the world we have inherited, the world we must work with, the world we will pass on to those who follow. But having glimpsed the alternatives, having seen how different things might have been, we carry with us a deeper understanding. We know that this world is not the only possible world, that different choices would have created different realities, that the future remains open to multiple possibilities. We know that no civilization has a monopoly on wisdom or virtue, that all cultures have both light and shadow, that synthesis and exchange are possible even in contexts of domination. We know that history is made by human choices, operating within constraints but not entirely determined by them. If you have found this exploration worthwhile, if the contemplation of alternate histories has enriched your understanding of our own timeline, consider subscribing to this channel for more journeys through the shadows of history. Leave a comment sharing where you are listening from tonight and what alternate history you would most like to explore. What other crossroads in history might have turned differently? What other worlds might have been born from different choices? The paths not taken are infinite, and each offers its own insights into the path we actually walk. Until we meet again in these quiet hours between sleep and waking, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be filled with all the worlds that might have been. The treasure ships of Zheng He sailed across the Indian Ocean and returned home, their greatest voyage never taken. But in our imagination, they sail still, crossing the vast Pacific, carrying the seeds of a different future, creating a world we can barely imagine, yet cannot help but wonder about. History is a garden of forking paths, and though we walk only one, we can glimpse the others branching away into infinite possibility. The journey ends, the moon sets, the alternate history fades like a dream upon waking, but the questions it raised remain, and the understanding it created persists. We return to our world, this specific timeline, this particular present, carrying with us the knowledge that things could have been otherwise. And in that knowledge lies both wisdom and responsibility, an understanding that our choices matter, that history is not finished, that the future is still being created with every decision we make. Thank you for joining me on this journey through an alternate past. May it illuminate our present and inspire our thinking about the future we want to create. The paths not taken teach us about the path we walk. And in understanding both, we become more conscious creators of what comes next. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, history is not destiny, and tomorrow is always another crossroads where new worlds might be born.